Okay, maybe we should just go ahead and get started. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's technical meeting on CARB's concepts for building embodied carbon reporting requirements. My name is Lex Mitchell, and I'm a section manager in our embodied carbon program. Thank you for joining us. I'll start off for the people in the room with a little announcement about bathrooms and fire safety, etc. If you're in the room, if you need to use the restroom, you can go straight back here, hang a left, go beyond the stained glass chandelier, and all the bathrooms are over in that area. If you need a pick-me-up, our cafe is open again. I don't think they open till 10, so that may or may not be available depending on the time. And if there is a fire alarm or anything like that, we will head out to the main entrance and cross to Cesar Chavez Park and regroup there and wait for an all clear and come back. We don't expect that, but just in case, it's good to know. So this is the second meeting in our technical meeting series that we're holding to support the development of our baseline and reporting framework for our embodied carbon program. Today, we'll discuss staff concepts for the reporting requirements for manufacturers of building materials and covered new construction projects. We'll walk through covered entities, specific reporting fields that would potentially be required, and reporting tools that staff has developed. So I just want to let everybody know your input is essential. These meetings are designed to bring together subject matter experts and to foster discussion. We value all of your input, your feedback, and the time that you spend with us to inform our process and to improve our concepts. So a few more logistics before we start. The meeting is being recorded and materials will be posted on the CARB website. Online participants may use the raise hand feature during the comment period. And please keep your comments brief to allow for broad participation. If we have enough time, we can go more than brief, but we'll just have to see how many comments people have. A public docket will also be available for written comments, which we very much appreciate. We read everything you write to us, and it does inform our future development. And given the technical nature of this meeting, we strongly encourage your written feedback. We always love the discussion here. But it's really nice to have a written record of things that you all think are very important so that we can put the emphasis on that. We'll begin with staff presentations, walking through the reporting requirements, and afterward we'll open the floor for in-person discussion and then invite comments from our online participants. So first I'll hand it over to Alex Moosbrugger, who will be guiding us through the meeting today.
Thank you, Lex. Good morning. I'm Alex Moosbrugger, an air resource engineer on the Embodied Carbon team. With today's meeting, we would like to update you on what staff has been working on. Can everybody hear me all right? We are hoping an in-person meeting will facilitate a lively discussion and technical feedback from subject matter experts. In this morning's presentation, we'll walk through staff's proposed building embodied carbon reporting requirements for building material manufacturers and importers. We'll start by recapping previous public engagements, including previous workshops and the recent baseline technical meeting. Next, we'll cover the background and statutory requirements that guide this work, as well as related programs that have informed our approach. Then, we'll discuss the proposed reporting requirements in detail, supply chain considerations, who the potentially regulated entities are, and staff concepts, the specific reporting requirements, and methods. We'll then walk through facility and importer reporting tools we've developed, and we'll end the morning session by inviting discussion and feedback on these staff concepts for reporting requirements. Before getting into the detailed reporting requirements, let's review the statutory requirements and briefly revisit the program's previous public engagements. In 2022 and 2023, the California legislature passed and the governor signed Assembly Bill 2446 and Assembly Bill 43, which direct CARB to reduce emissions from building materials in the state's building sector by 40% compared to a 2026 baseline, no later than 2035. These bills are codified in the California Health and Safety Code, Section 38561.3 and 38561.6. The first statutory deadline for the Embodied Carbon Program is to adopt a framework for measuring the carbon intensity, or CI, of building materials by the end of 2026. This CI framework encompasses both the baseline estimation presented in September and the reporting topics presented today. The baseline quantifies the current life cycle emissions affiliated with building materials, and the reporting framework uses collected data to track progress towards any greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets established in future years. After the reporting regulation is adopted, 2028 is the statutory deadline to finalize a comprehensive reduction strategy. Any programs implemented that are responsive to this strategy will help ensure that the state achieves a 40% net reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions of building materials by 2035. The key milestones for this program are highlighted in this graphic. We are planning to release a draft version of the reporting regulation and hold a third and final public workshop in early 2026, with a target board hearing date of May 2026. This timeline envisions the reporting regulation going into effect at the beginning of 2027. The next legislatively mandated deadlines are, again, to finalize a comprehensive reduction strategy by 2028 and to achieve the 40% net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions for building materials by 2035. Today's meeting focuses on that first milestone, establishing the reporting framework that will provide the data foundation for everything that follows. Statutory reporting requirements for both covered projects and building materials are detailed in two key subparts of Health and Safety Code, Section 38561.3. Under Section 38561.3, subsection C, paragraph 1, construction projects with a minimum size of 5 new residential units or 10,000 square feet of non-residential building space must submit a life cycle assessment, or LCA, to CARB. Paragraph 2 states that in addition to project reporting requirements, building material manufacturers must also provide environmental product declarations, EPDs, or other similarly robust life cycle data for the products they produce. Before we move forward, let's briefly revisit our previous public engagements. So far, CARB has hosted 2 public workshops and 1 technical meeting. Our kickoff workshop in September 2024 introduced building embodied carbon concepts and consulted with the public about key topics in developing the framework, including the structure of a potential reporting system. Our second workshop in March 2025 introduced staff concepts for reporting by manufacturers and project owners, baseline emissions quantification, and emissions accounting. Most recently, in September 2025, last month, we held a technical meeting specifically focused on the baseline. We discussed staff baseline concepts, released the draft baseline methodology, and released the draft baseline assessment tool. All workshop documents and recordings are available on the CARB website. Back to the content of today's meeting. To review, the statute defines 2 categories of reporting entities under the relevant section of Health and Safety Code: manufacturers and importers of building materials, and new construction project property owners. In this morning's session, we'll discuss reporting requirements for manufacturers and importers of building materials. This afternoon, we'll discuss the requirements for covered projects. I will now hand off the presentation to my colleague, Jeff Kessler.
Thanks, Alex.
Real quick, Jeff, before you start, I just want to remind everyone the slides are already online, so you don't need to take a picture of the slides. Probably the quality of our PDF is better than your pictures. Go ahead, Jeff. Sorry.
Great. Thanks. Thanks, Lex. Thanks, Alex. I'm Jeff Kessler, a lead staff working on CARB's Embodied Carbon program. As a brief recap of staff's presentation in September, we're proposing to use the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's U.S. Environmentally Extended Input-Output Model, the U.S. EEIO, to estimate baseline emissions. Conceptually, the total economic demand for California building materials is multiplied by their sector-specific greenhouse gas emissions intensities, and the result of that multiplication is a statewide estimate of emissions that are attributable to the building sector, as seen in the graphic here. This visual Sorry. This visual illustrates how the baseline will be used and how it relates to the data that we plan to start collecting from entities that would be potentially required to report to our program. The baseline serves two important roles for the embodied carbon program. First, it helps reveal the products or industries with the highest emissions in the building sector. This helps CARB staff identify key reporting and submittal requirements that will ensure that the highest emissions subsectors and materials are being reported to CARB. Relevant and accurate reporting is essential for CARB to track progress towards any future emissions reduction targets that may be established. Second, the baseline modeling approach provides sector-specific emissions intensities that are relevant to specific building material industries. Due to this level of disaggregation, the baseline and baseline methodologies will help to identify how different policies, programs, and future regulations can be used to achieve an overall 40% net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions for the building sector. Establishing a baseline is the first step toward developing future compliance strategies and any additional emissions reduction regulations that may be necessary to achieve the statutory goals. In other words, the baseline helps guide reporting priorities for this rulemaking cycle and will also inform future emissions reduction strategies. The baseline tells us where the largest emissions are in order to focus reporting and future policy that will allow the state to meet the 40% reduction target. Now, let's talk about the background for building material reporting. First, let's highlight the specific statutory provisions that guide building material reporting. Health and Safety Code Section 38561.3 C2 requires manufacturers of building materials to submit an environmental product declaration or similarly robust material life cycle assessment. Health and Safety Code Section 38561.3 I-5 requires manufacturers to report data to ensure that their products comply with applicable reduction targets that will be established by the state board. And then finally, HSC Section 38561.3D allows CARB to adopt a tracking and reporting mechanism to facilitate the reporting of data to the state board. These provisions give us both the mandate and the flexibility to design a reporting system that meets California's needs while minimizing burdens on regulated entities. Staff has reviewed related policies and programs to understand what's already working and where we can align our reporting requirements. On the product carbon intensity reporting side, we reviewed the Buy Clean California Act of 2017, the California Green Building Standards Code, embodied carbon requirements from 2024, and other state Buy Clean policies, including Buy Clean Colorado, Washington's Buy Fair, and Buy Clean Oregon. On the facility emissions reporting side, we've looked at the U.S. EPA Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, CARB's own mandatory greenhouse gas reporting regulation, or MRR, and recent California legislation, including SB 253 on corporate data accountability and SB 261 on climate-related financial risk disclosure. By aligning with existing reporting requirements where possible, we aim to reduce duplicative reporting burdens while ensuring that we collect data we will need to operate a statewide embodied carbon program. I will now hand off the presentation to my colleague, Marieke Fenton.
Hi, I'm Mari Fenton, the lead economist working on CARB's embodied carbon program. Statute makes clear the need for an emissions reduction target for building materials used in California. To have an accurate estimate of emissions from regulated building materials, it's important to know both the quantity and the source of materials. However, is this better? All right. Project for the room. All right. However, this quantity and source information can be complicated because building material supply chains are complex. Many manufacturers outside of California cannot reliably track where their products are used. The products may be shared with the distributor, who may send the products to multiple final locations. Importers, on the other hand, know the quantity of regulated building materials that they import into the state. Therefore, in order to accurately track the quantity of building materials being imported into California, staff suggests that importers report quantities and source information to CARB, in addition to required reporting by material manufacturers. So who would be subject to reporting requirements? Staff's concept is that the following entities would be subject to annual emissions reporting requirements. First, manufacturers of covered products doing business in California with 10 million or more in annual revenue. And second, importers of covered products with 1 million or more in annual revenue. These revenue thresholds are designed to focus reporting requirements on the entities that account for the majority of emissions while reducing burden on smaller operations. We welcome feedback on whether these thresholds are appropriate or if alternative approaches should be considered. A key element of the staff proposal is the product source disclosure concept. The product source disclosure is some form of documentation that supplies product source information for the next entity in the supply chain. This declaration would be required for all regulated building materials used in California. For building materials manufactured in California, a product source declaration would be generated by the in-state manufacturer. For imported building materials, this product source declaration will be generated by the importer. The product source information to be disclosed to the supply chain includes, first, the manufacturer and originating manufacturing facility of the regulated building material, and second, the importer if the product was brought into California from outside the state. The importer or in-state manufacturer would submit an attestation to CARB attesting that they have disseminated product source information to the best of their abilities. Additionally, importers would be required to report material quantities to CARB. In-state manufacturers would be required to report material quantities and emissions to CARB. If out-of-state manufacturers do not report emissions data to CARB, the staff concept for reporting is that CARB would assign conservative default carbon intensities to imported products. We'll discuss these reporting requirements in more depth and show concept reporting templates later in the presentation. Continuing on, it's important to note the required frequency of generating disclosure documentation as part of the concept record-keeping requirements. In-state manufacturing facilities would generate relevant disclosure documents once per reporting period to ensure that documentation remains up-to-date and relevant to each reporting period. Importers would similarly generate disclosure documentation once per reporting period for each out-of-state manufacturing facility from which they import products. The same up-to-date disclosure documentation should be disseminated with all regulated building materials from the same manufacturing facility, and documentation should be duplicated and disseminated when shipments split. These disclosures will inform the end user of the product source. Regulated in-state manufacturers that use regulated building materials as process inputs, as well as covered products, should obtain and retain relevant product source disclosures for all regulated building materials that they use. The document originators and the regulated building material users, for them there would be a 10-year record-keeping requirement to support verification and compliance activities. This diagram illustrates how the product source disclosure concept would work in practice. In this example, an out-of-state manufacturer sells its newly created products to reseller 1. Reseller 1 sells the product to reseller 2, who's located in California and is the first entity to take possession of the product in California, so they are the importer here. As the importer, reseller 2 would create relevant product source disclosure documentation. When selling their products, reseller 2 would provide a product source declaration for entities down the supply chain so that those downstream entities could identify the originating manufacturing facility and importer. When reporting to CARB, reseller 2 would attest that they have disclosed product source and information to entities in the supply chain to the best of their ability alongside other reporting requirements. This product may move through multiple resellers before reaching the building project site, or being remanufactured in-state into a new building product. In the end, the building project or in-state manufacturer would be required to obtain and retain records that would allow them to substantiate the product sourcing information for the relevant regulated building materials. Throughout this chain, a product source declaration associated with regulated material shipments would ensure that supply chain participants can identify the originating manufacturing facility and identify the importer of the material if the product was imported. The identified manufacturers and importers are those with reporting obligations regarding quantity and sourcing. This approach provides transparency and accountability throughout the supply chain. And now let's move on to talk about the details of the currently proposed recording requirements. This chart shows the preliminary staff estimates for California building sector emissions by material type using the US EEIO model that we discussed in our September technical meeting on the baseline. Staff considered two main criteria to establish the set of manufacturing industries to prioritize for reporting. First, we looked at building materials that contributed significantly to overall greenhouse gas emissions. As you can see from this chart, cement, concrete, and gypsum account for 14% of baseline emissions. Metal products account for 12%. Wood products, transportation, and various other categories also contribute significantly. Second, we consider materials currently reporting in existing federal or state buy-clean programs. This allows us to build on existing infrastructure and reduce duplicative reporting. By combining these two criteria, we can focus our initial efforts on where they'll have the greatest impact while leveraging existing reporting frameworks. This is how we've prioritized different materials for reporting based on their emissions impacts and their precedence in existing related programs. Phase 1 materials are those with high emission impacts and precedence in existing green procurement programs. These are cement, concrete, steel, glass, asphalt, insulation, and wood products. Phase 2 materials are those with high emissions impacts, but less precedence in existing programs. These include aluminum, clay and ceramics, lime and gypsum products, and additional sectors not currently part of state or federal buy-clean programs. This phased approach allows us to implement reporting in a manageable way, learning from Phase 1 before expanding to Phase 2. Staff has put together a concept implementation timeline for covered building materials reporting. Phase 1 covered building materials reporting would begin with the 2026 reporting year. This includes cement and concrete, iron, steel, and ferroalloy products, glass and glass products, asphalt, pavement, and shingles, insulation, and wood products. Phase 2 covered building materials reporting would begin with the 2028 reporting year. This would add aluminum, clay and ceramics, lime and gypsum products, and additional sectors not currently part of state or federal buy-clean programs. As industry familiarity with embodied carbon reporting improves, and as product category rules and related environmental product declarations, or EPDs, are created that can meet CARB standards for EPDs, staff concept is to move to a system of emissions reporting that better leverages EPDs. This would result in changes to reporting requirements in 2030. The staff concept would improve the exportability and applicability of this reporting regulation to other jurisdictions and programs. This phased approach gives manufacturers and importers time to prepare systems and processes for reporting while allowing CARB to refine our tools and procedures based on Phase 1 and Phase 2 experiences. This table provides specifics on what would be covered in each phase. For each category, we've identified NAICS codes that describe the industries and facilities that would report, along with relevant HS headings that describe the products. The HS headings provide the specific product classifications that would be covered under each category. This level of specificity is important for importers who need to know which products trigger reporting requirements. I will now pass the presentation back to Alex.
Mari. Thank you, Mari. Hello again, folks. Now, let's walk through an example reporting timeline, starting with the initial 2026 reporting period and highlight when covered materials are expected to be phased in. For the 2026 reporting period, the reported data would be due in Q1 of 2027 for Phase 1 materials, using the best available data. For the 2027 reporting period, again, Phase 1 materials would be reported, and the reporting deadline falls in Q1 of 2028. For the 2028 reporting period, both Phase 1 and Phase 2 materials would be reported, with data due in Q1 2029. This pattern continues, giving entities a consistent annual rhythm for data collection and reporting. Statute explicitly states that these regulations do not apply to appliances. To define what an appliance is, CARB staff proposes aligning with the California Appliance Efficiency Regulations developed by the California Energy Commission. Here's a portion of the examples from the California Energy Commission's comprehensive list of appliances. Among other things, refrigeration equipment, air conditioning units, electronics, and kitchen and laundry appliances would all be explicitly excluded from reporting requirements. I'll now hand the presentation right back to Mari.
Thanks, Alex. We'll now move on to discuss the specific methods available to manufacturers to report. Staff concept is that manufacturers may use either of the potential methods listed below for reporting emissions affiliated with covered building materials to CARB. Method 1 would rely on environmental product declarations that meet CARB-specified submission requirements. Due to the numerous comments staff received from interested parties and potentially regulated entities, staff are proposing that this method would become the only method available for reporting for the 2030 reporting period onward. Method 2 reporting would rely on facility-specific data that aligns with existing regulatory reporting programs. Staff is interested in meeting with interested parties to better understand any concerns with phasing out Method 2 reporting in 2030. Under both reporting methods, manufacturers would also provide attestations related to dissemination of product source disclosures, which we described earlier in the presentation. Facilities that are already reporting to CARB under CARB's mandatory reporting regulation may opt in to a simplified reporting method to fulfill reporting requirements rather than using Method 1 or Method 2 reporting. This option is available for facilities reporting under the mandatory reporting regulation, as these facilities are already reporting significant relevant data to CARB. Building material manufacturers already reporting under CARB's mandatory reporting regulation would only need to report Scope 2 and upstream Scope 3 emissions, which would be calculated using CARB-specified emissions factors, along with basic facility identifying information. Using data already reported alongside the supplemental Scope 2 and upstream Scope 3 emissions outlined here, staff would be able to assign average conservative carbon intensities to products produced by facilities reporting under CARB's mandatory reporting regulation. Facilities reporting under CARB's mandatory reporting regulation may still make use of CARB's facility reporting calculator, which is the tool that non-MRR reporting facilities use to help meet record-keeping requirements, and would still be allowed to provide complete Method 1 or Method 2 reports to meet recording requirements. We're going to start here to talk about Method 1 and the challenges associated with relying on EPDs. While EPDs, or Environmental Product Declarations, are an important tool in the voluntary market, currently available EPDs present significant challenges for use as a primary reporting mechanism. Currently available EPDs lack coverage, consistency, comparability, and data quality. More specifically, issues with current EPDs include that no EPDs are available for many building materials. Their inconsistent and outdated primary and background data make comparison difficult. Limited life cycle assessment data transparency and opaque data verification standards undermine confidence in results. Bundled environmental attribute concerns, such as renewable energy credits and voluntary offsets, make it hard to assess and compare emissions. Varied system boundaries due to different product category rules mean that EPDs may not be comparing apples to apples. No unified emissions factor database means different EPDs use different assumptions. And finally, no clear chain of custody for key materials makes verification challenging. Because of these limitations, staff concept is that if manufacturers choose to report using EPDs, those EPDs must meet specific CARB requirements to ensure consistency, comparability, and reliability. For manufacturers who choose to report using EPDs, here are the scope and data requirements that CARB staff puts forward today. For scope and validity, the EPD must be facility and product specific. The life cycle assessment scope must be specified. At a minimum, the EPD must include modules A1, A2, and A3. The EPD must conform to the requirements of ISO 14040, ISO 14044, and ISO 21930, and it must be third-party verified. For data requirements, primary data must be less than 2 years old. Primary emissions data must be measured and calculated using methodology consistent with CARB's mandatory reporting regulation or EPA's greenhouse gas reporting program. Emissions factors must be harmonized with emissions factors accepted by CARB for reporting and accounting. And primary impact results that rely on supply chain specific data must also be reported using CARB approved default emissions factors. This is critical for comparability. Additionally, for disaggregation of results, staff concept is that EPD results must be disaggregated by life cycle stage so that it's clear where emissions are occurring. Results must be clearly disclosed with and without any environmental attributes, such as renewable energy credits or carbon offsets. This transparency is essential. Contracted purchases of renewable energy or fuels used in the calculation of primary impact results must also be separately disclosed. All products, co-products, and key waste flows from facilities must be clearly disclosed. In the case of co-products, physical and economic allocation results must be disclosed. These requirements are designed to address the consistency, comparability, and transparency issues we identified with current EPDs. Staff received numerous comments from potentially regulated entities and other interested parties in response to past workshops. Many of these comments requested that CARB better leverage EPDs that are used for voluntary disclosure. Given concerns staff have raised around EPD quality, staff does not believe that leveraging EPDs available today will meet reporting goals. Staff also recognize that it will take time for the market to develop EPDs that meet the standards laid out here. The current staff concept is to move to a system that better leverages EPDs in the future. Aligning with this goal, staff concept is that method 1 reporting will be the only method for reporting manufacturing data for the 2030 calendar year onward. Passing the presentation back to my colleague, Jeff.
Thanks, Mari. Let's now discuss method 2 for emissions reporting. This is the facility-specific data that aligns with existing regulatory reporting programs. Under method 2 reporting, CARB will utilize a streamlined approach for data collection and provide a tool that estimates product carbon intensities. And this tool was posted online in advance of the meeting today. Building material manufacturers would report facility-level production data that includes direct total facility-level greenhouse gas emissions and underlying data to support greenhouse gas estimates, aligning with the relevant U.S. EPA Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program subparts or CARB's MRR subparts. They'd also need to report material and energy input, physical quantities and costs delineated by NAICS code, and then products, co-products, and waste physical quantities and revenue apportionments by product and co-product. This approach would build on existing reporting infrastructure and provides a consistent methodology for calculating product-specific carbon intensities across a variety of different facilities. This diagram shows the 3 scopes of emissions that would be calculated under the method 2 reporting option. Scope 1 represents the direct on-site process emissions and fuel combustion, and these emissions would be calculated using the GHGRP or MRR methods that are already in place. Scope 2 represents the indirect emissions from consumption of purchased electricity, heat, or steam. And these would be calculated from energy purchases using CARB-specified emissions factors. And then finally, upstream scope 3 represents indirect emissions from purchased materials, and these would be calculated from product inputs using CARB-specified emissions factors. Together, these 3 scopes provide a comprehensive picture of the emissions associated with manufacturing activity. To ensure consistency and accuracy in reporting emissions, staff proposes using the North American Industry Classification System, or NAICS, to classify material inputs. NAICS is the standard that's used by federal agencies in classifying businesses for the purposes of collecting, analyzing, and publishing data related to the U.S. economy. And a NAICS code has 6 digits. The first 2 digits represent the sector, and each additional digit adds more specificity down to the national industry level. By requiring facilities to classify their material and energy inputs using and ensuring accuracy for reporting. For Scope 2 and upstream Scope 3 emissions, the approach is a little bit different. These would be estimated using standardized emission factors and a facility-level material and energy balance. These inputs would be reported using spend-based accounting, and associated emissions factors would be delineated using NAICS codes. This standardized approach ensures comparability across facilities and materials while reducing reporting burdens by not requiring detailed life cycle assessments for every single input. This slide shows how the pieces come together to calculate total facility-level greenhouse gas emissions. User-reported data is shown in the yellow boxes, CARB-provided data is in the blue boxes, and tool-calculated results is in the green boxes. Indirect emissions are calculated by taking each input and multiplying the quantity in dollars by the CARB-provided emissions factors, and then summing across all inputs. Indirect emissions are added to the direct emissions total, which are calculated by reporting entities using the relevant GHGRP or MRR subpart methodologies. The sum of direct emissions plus indirect emissions equals totally facility-specific greenhouse gas emissions. Once the total facility-specific emissions are determined, it is possible to calculate a product-specific carbon intensity. The carbon intensity for product, in this case P, is calculated by taking the revenue for product P, dividing by the total facility revenue, and then multiplying by total emissions to allocate the total facility emissions to a specific product. Dividing the total emissions for product P by the physical quantity of product P gives the carbon intensity in carbon dioxide equivalents per physical unit. The economic allocation approach ensures that emissions are fairly distributed across products and co-products based on their economic value, consistent with the baseline methodology that staff presented in September. I will now pass the presentation back to Alex.
Thanks, Jeff. These next slides summarize the two reporting methods we've described so far and the abbreviated reporting option for facilities that already report under CARB's mandatory greenhouse gas reporting regulation. The first method of reporting for material manufacturers uses CARB-approved environmental product declarations. Under this method, key information required includes reporter and facility information, including company contact information, locations, NAICS codes, annual revenue, and a product source disclosure attestation. EPD data, including global warming potential for life cycle stages A1, A2, and A3 from the EPD that is generated using CARB-specified requirements, which is consistent with statutory direction, and product information, including descriptions, NAICS and HS codes, quantities, and declared values. Under Method 2 reporting, in which manufacturers report facility-specific data, key information includes reporter and facility information, including company contact information, locations, NAICS codes, annual revenue, and a product source disclosure attestation, direct emissions, calculated using Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program or California's MRR methodology, process inputs, which would include physical quantity, purchased cost, and NAICS codes for each input, and production information, including NAICS codes, physical quantity, and revenue attribution for each output. Instead of reporting under Method 1 or Method 2, facilities already reporting to the mandatory reporting regulation may opt in to using an abbreviated reporting template. The key information required from facilities eligible to use this abbreviated template instead of Method 1 or Method 2 reporting includes reporter and facility information, including company contact information, locations, NAICS codes, and a product source disclosure attestation, and Scope 2 and upstream Scope 3 emissions calculated in the same manner as for Method 2 reporting. MRR facilities that opt in to using this abbreviated reporting template instead of using Method 1 or Method 2 reporting are opting in to having CARB-assigned carbon intensities for their products, informed by these data and data already collected under existing CARB programs. Now we'll move on to reporting requirements for importers of building materials. Staff's concept for importer reporting is straightforward. The importer would be required to report the following information to CARB for all regulated building materials they import into California. Importer information, who they are and how to contact them. Material identification information, what products are being imported. Material physical quantity and declared value, how much and what it's worth. Importer annual revenue, product source and manufacturer contact information, where the products come from, and an attestation related to the dissemination of product source disclosures. This information would allow CARB to track quantities of materials entering California and to connect those materials back to their manufacturing sources to assess product carbon intensities and track overall emissions over time. Under the current staff concept, starting in 2030, importers would be required to report EPDs that meet CARB standards, aligning with the staff concept to phase out Method 2 reporting for the 2030 reporting year. Staff is seeking additional feedback on this concept. This slide summarizes the specific data fields for importer reporting. Reporter information would include name of company, company address, contact email address, phone number, and annual company revenue. Product information would include product identification, declared value and physical quantity, manufacturer and facility name, address, and contact information, a product source disclosure attestation, and starting in 2030, EPDs that meet CARB standards. This is a more limited set of data compared to the manufacturer reporting because importers may not have access to detailed emissions data, but they do have information about quantities and sourcing. This table summarizes the building material reporting requirements for the different types of reporting entities and gives a recap of how reporting requirements differ across entity types. All reporters, whether non-MRR reporting facilities, MRR reporting facilities, or importers, would provide reporter contact information and reporting company information. Non-mandatory reporting regulation facilities would provide manufacturer information, quantity of materials sold into California, process inputs and outputs, NAICS categories, and emission information. MRR facilities may meet reporting requirements by using an abbreviated reporting template that would only require disclosure of calculated Scope 2 and upstream Scope 3 emissions. The abbreviated reporting requirement effectively allows MRR reporting facilities to opt out of reporting product quantity and process input information to the Embodied Carbon Program, as similar data is already collected through the mandatory reporting regulation. Importers would provide manufacturer information and quantity of materials. Lastly, all reporters would provide product source disclosure attestations. I will now pass the presentation to my colleague Spencer, who will walk through the reporting templates.
Thanks, Alex. Good morning. I'm Spencer Wright, a licensed engineer working on CARB's Embodied Carbon Program. Now that we have shared staff concepts for reporting requirements, let's discuss the tools that CARB has developed to facilitate this reporting. CARB staff has developed tools that will be provided for reporters to calculate emissions and to submit data aligned with regulatory requirements. The facility reporting tool is for manufacturers. There is also an abbreviated reporting tool, which is available for facilities already reporting under California's mandatory greenhouse gas reporting regulation, or MRR. Finally, there is a separate importer reporting tool. These tools are designed to align with regulatory requirements and streamline data submission. First, let's walk through the facility reporting tool. Rather than a live Excel demo, we've prepared slides to make it easier to follow. The first tab in the facility reporting tool collects basic contact information for the person completing the report. This ensures we can follow up if clarification is needed. Next, we gather facility-specific details, including location and industry type. The EPD data reporting sheet allows facilities to report using CARB-approved environmental product declarations, or EPDs. This is the Method 1 reporting approach, which allows reporters to use verified product-level data instead of facility-specific emissions calculations under Method 2 reporting. Along with the EPD declaration IDs, facilities will also report product quantities and values in US dollars. The direct emissions sheet marks the start of Method 2 reporting. Reporters would calculate their total direct emissions or facility-specific Scope 1 emissions using EPA's GHGRP or CARB's MRR calculation methodologies. This ensures consistency with existing regulatory frameworks and the data that is already being provided by facilities reporting under MRR. Links to the subparts of GHGRP and MRR are provided. Continuing with Method 2 reporting, the Indirect Emissions tab collects data to calculate Scope 2 emissions, which are emissions from purchased electricity, steam, heat, and cooling. The reporter would provide the total purchase cost and quantity of each Scope 2 input. Wrapping up emission collections for Method 2, the Process Input sheet collects data on process inputs used in the manufacturing process. CARB uses the total purchase cost and CARB-provided emission factors to calculate upstream Scope 3 emissions. Switching over from inputs to products, the Production Information sheet collects the products, co-products, and waste products from the facility. We ask for products to be reported and aggregated to a level consistent with 6-digit NAICS codes. Finally, the Estimated Product Emissions tab calculates total facility emissions and allocates them to products based on revenue. This helps determine product-level carbon intensities. No input is required from the reporter. Now we'll walk through the version of the tool designed for facilities already reporting under MRR. As with the general tool, we begin by collecting contact information for the person completing the report. The reported information sheet is nearly identical to the facility reporting tool, but it does not collect annual revenue or question if the information is confidential. The Facility Information tab captures basic facility information similar to the general tool, but with fewer items to report. Facilities reporting under this tool must provide Scope 2 and upstream Scope 3 emissions estimates. These values should be calculated using the facility reporting tool previously presented. Providing Scope 1 emissions is optional, as this data is already calculated and published annually by MRR staff. Next, we'll walk through the Importer Reporting tool, which is designed for entities importing building materials into California. As with the other tools, we start by collecting contact information for the person submitting the report. The Product Information sheet captures a list of the regulated building materials being imported into California by the reporting importer. This information is essential for tracking embodied carbon in imported products. It also collects sourcing information associated with the out-of-state manufacturer for the imported products. I will now hand the presentation back to Alex.
Thank you, Spencer. This concludes the content section of our presentation, well ahead of schedule, I might add, and we will be opening the floor for public comment and discussion. In the following slides, we have outlined some of the areas in which we are most interested in receiving your feedback. First, are there ways that we could structure our tools so that data could be submitted more easily? Are there other relevant supply chain reporting options that could streamline product source disclosure to ensure product sourcing and reporter information is accurately disclosed down the supply chain? Is there a common physical unit that could be used to track materials through diverse stages of the supply chain? And are there preferred physical units for specific sectors or specific product categories? Are there additional NAICS sectors and product HS headings that should be included in reporting to accurately cover the materials that are reporting priorities? Are there specific concerns about submitting quantity data from importers? And are these concerns specific to certain products or places of origin? Are there specific concerns with phasing out Method 2 reporting for 2030 reported data? Are there alternative approaches that CARB should consider to get data on the quantities of building materials manufactured outside of California and used in California? Are there alternative annual revenue thresholds that should be considered for exemption from reporting for manufacturers or for importers? And how would these alternative thresholds be defined? How much time or monetary cost do you anticipate it will take your organization to complete the reporting requirements as discussed today, for both facility-specific data and for environmental product declarations that meet CARB standards? And do you have additional suggestions for reducing reporting time and/or costs? Would your organization do this reporting in-house, or would an external entity handle this process? And finally, does your organization already report similar or related data for other purposes not discussed today that CARB could build upon or use to meet reporting requirements? We will have on the original schedule until 11:30 a.m. for an open discussion, and then we'll transition into a public comment period.
Thanks, Alex. So we're now entering the moderated discussion section of today's technical meeting. So this is the technical discussion part of the meeting. And so we'll kick off this technical discussion period. The purpose of the technical discussion is to have an open-ended discussion relating to the technical details presented today. We invite attendees to ask clarifying questions related to the material presented today. If you do want to talk, ask questions, I think the most simplistic and organized method for folks in the room is if you just turn your name tag on its side to get into the queue stack, and then we can go around and answer questions in that way. If you are virtual participants, please use the Q&A functionality of Zoom. And as a moderator, I will try to do a good job of integrating some Q&A questions that we'll take in the room. Once the technical discussion portion wraps up, we'll move on to the public comment period. As Alex noted, we do have a decent amount of time, so we're breaking at noon, and then we'll start the next session at 1 p.m. So if the discussion kind of wraps up here, we'll move to the public comment period. If you have something that's more of a comment and less in the technical discussion, we encourage you to hold that until the actual public comment period. But yeah, we also encourage participants that do have public comments to submit those comments in writing, especially if they're technical or detailed in nature. It really helps us better understand and track those kinds of comments. So I'll turn it to the room for anybody that has things to contribute to the technical discussion.
And
Thanks.
I'll just jump in and say that as well. I know we presented a lot of really dense content. So if anybody wants us to go back to some slides to bring those back up, please let us know. We can obviously go back to slides and talk about some of those concepts in more detail. And as we said, we will have a public comment period for written comments open until the 8th of December. So folks, we expect to take some time to digest these materials, and we know we posted them in advance of the meeting, but not sufficiently probably for you all to read through everything. So thank you though.
Yeah, Nathan.
Nathan Forrest with the California Nevada Cement Association. It occurs to me that for some of the facilities within the cement and concrete space, there will be many, many thousands of EPDs generated every year. And I'm wondering if there wouldn't be some more streamlined way to approach this and transfer data than a spreadsheet, and whether EPD operators could develop some kind of a data transfer protocol for those facilities that CARB would be interested in.
Yeah, that's a great point to raise. We would love to be able to better interface and streamline accepting of reporting things through some kind of transmission possibility. So right now we are in the process of designing a reporting tool that will interface and accept data. And so we should probably set up some time. And if you have concepts for ways to streamline that kind of getting data to CARB, we'd love to talk with you more to better understand and hopefully try to integrate that into our iterative tool production process.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, I mean, I think we're aware that there are a number of emerging standards for digital EPDs that have been proposed. So I think we haven't seen a lot of comments from folks on what specific types of systems they would like to see. But I think that is something that we'd very much like to see. I think we put out some draft templates, which really outline the concepts in the data in a kind of a flat way so you can see it. Obviously, we want to develop a more robust, secure system for accepting data that's reported to CARB. And we're going through that process internally. But I think, as we said, we'd love to hear more from stakeholders in the room about, what types of digital EPD systems you've been using, and what kinds of standards we might be able to adopt for that. I see Justin over there.
Hi, good morning. Justin Kosher with PIMA, the Polyisocyanurate Insulation Manufacturers Association. So my questions, comments revolve around the method 1 option. In one of the slides, just kind of a clarifying question for those companies or industries that'll be part of the phase 1, there was a note about the 2026 reporting period, and below it said best available information. I would like a little clarification on what that meant, and that may be something that needs to be expanded for multiple reporting years. I understand method 2 is sort of a glide path until everyone can achieve method 1. But from an insulation industry standpoint, EPD practice is fairly well ingrained. We've been doing it for more than a decade. So I expect there would be a lot of interest in just using method 1 immediately. And some of the criteria that CARB outlined, I just think might outpace the LCA and EPD practice today. Like in particular, that less than 2-year primary data, we might get to a point where you're constantly feeding generators that information. And so each year you can pop out an EPD that exists for the prior year. I don't think we're there across industry groups. And so I would be interested to learn a little bit more about what that best available exception, and maybe there's the opportunity to extend that best available option, especially for phase 1 products, where you're wanting information in a little over 14 months, moving people in the right direction, but providing some flexibility until technology, data collection practices catch up. Because I'll stop here. That 2-year is a significant jump forward from a PCR standpoint and things like that. So it's a big jump forward. It just might need a much longer runway till we realize that reality. So.
Yeah, thanks. So I appreciate the requests for clarity on best available data for 2026. So a lot of that thinking is around, so data would need to start being collected in 2026 to then report during Q1 of 2027. We recognize that with a May board hearing in May of 2026, there might be entities that have not actually pulled together data for the start of the year. And so the best available has to do more with the gaps in data availability for a given reporting year, as opposed to an EPD kind of flexibility was in the concept, right? So I don't think we were intending to say that we would be more flexible on the CARB standard for EPDs as best available data. It was more on flexibility of available data. So if it's difficult to meet the CARB EPD standard, then we think that the method 2 pathway would be the appropriate way to provide the best available data. And so, maybe importers don't have quantity data or information affiliated with the first half of the year until the reporting requirement would go into effect. And so that would be an abbreviated or truncated year affiliated with the data rather than a different method accepted for reporting, if that makes sense.
And I think on the EPD side too, as Jeff said, I think we want to hear feedback on the feasibility of these concepts. As we said, there's maybe some portion of the year might be available, maybe not a complete set of data that we've requested. On the EPD side, we've proposed that 2030 timeline because, if you think EPDs that were issued in the next year that were valid for 5 years, that would basically be when those EPDs would expire. And so I think we would hope that over that period of time that folks could start to integrate, this kind of, as you said, updated data pipeline for those EPD processors to prepare more timely EPDs that better reflected their current production processes. And, obviously, in the event that those EPDs don't have significant changes, perhaps that data reporting burden is limited for those types of facilities that haven't made any significant changes to their production processes. So I think, like I said, with the best available data, I think we're looking for feedback on what can be done given that timeline. I think truncation is a great example of one flexibility that we could offer. And then I think with respect to that timeline for EPDs, we're interested in feedback. I think the digital EPD is another piece of that, like how is the EPDs being transmitted, but definitely with respect to the timeliness of when we can think we could start to adopt these types of carbon accounting principles into the EPDs.
There's a couple of questions in the Q&A online. So I'm just going to read that out and then for an answer. There's a question on how are steel products defined? Is this limited to just structural steel? And so in the staff concept put forward, it would be affiliated with the NAICS identifiers for that industry. So it would not just be limited to structural steel. It would be, if you are a steel producing facility, you would potentially have a reporting requirement. And I'll jump to, I believe, Joseph, you had.
Thank you. Joseph Shackett with Eastern Research Group. Getting back to the question on, I think Justin sort of alluded to the PCRs are going to require to be updated to meet some of the requirements you're proposing, and that process can take quite a bit of time. And I'm curious, I guess the first question is sort of around once those PCRs are updated, and one thing that caught my attention was reporting for both for allocation based economically as well as mass or whatever physical units. Do you anticipate that will kind of permeate up the supply chain in the sense that if I'm a manufacturer and I'm allocating my co-products both ways, but I have inputs that are coming from an upstream manufacturer, they're allocating products, co-products. Do you anticipate those upstream manufacturers will also have to provide that data in both kind of ways, if that makes sense?
Well, I think if the materials that you're talking about as inputs are also regulated building materials under this regulation, then if they were reported to CARB, then yes, those EPDs would also be having both allocation methods. I think that for those who probably have worked in the space of producing EPDs or doing LCAs for some time, there's obviously significant limitations and challenges to using physical allocation for co-products, given that often co-products have significant differences in economic value. Now, I understand that obviously there's, there's a lot of existing EPDs that are using natural systems or physical units for allocation. I think the concept here is really about increasing transparency within the EPD and allowing for the appropriate comparisons. And we hope that obviously by promulgating these standards for EPDs, that we can help increase the quality of EPDs across the sector and up and down your own supply chains so that you do have better data coming in. But I do think it's going to be predicated on those materials that are covered under this regulation. Obviously, there's a lot of jurisdictions that leverage EPDs for different types of programs, and including voluntary programs, which many in the room participate in, which leverage EPDs. And the expectation is that by CARB putting forward perhaps some concepts for EPD data standards, that other agencies and other entities may or may not be willing or interested in also taking up those standards as well.
Thanks. And do you anticipate evaluating PCRs to make sure the PCR specifies the right approach to conform to CARB's requirements?
That's a great question. I think right now, at this point, we are just starting to really think about maybe convening some experts to discuss engagement through the PCR process. It's something that I've been talking to some academics and LCA experts about. I think we're very interested. If you are interested, folks in the room and others, perhaps colleagues or stakeholders that please have them reach out to us. I think we'd very much like to engage with folks who are engaged in the PCR process, as well as the program operators who hold those convenings. I think we have outlined some verification requirements, which are pretty flexible with respect to adherence to the verification requirement in the PCR. And we hope that those verifiers would then look to the CARB requirements to verify that the EPDs were produced to the CARB requirements, as they do for your current PCRs, right? Your current verifiers are reading the standard, looking at your EPD and saying, okay, this looks like they did it the way that it's supposed to be done. I give it the stamp, right? And that's your SCS Globals, JBEs, whoever is probably your current verifier for your EPD. And so I think, the hope is that those verifiers, by CARB promulgating some clear standards, would be able to use those to then verify EPDs or PCRs to those standards.
There's another question in the Q&A online that I'll jump to, which is how is glass defined, flat glass or process glass? And again, similar to the steel answer, we are defining reporting requirements around NAICS code, so that would apply likely to both the flat glass and process glass glass manufacturers. So both would have reporting requirements potentially under this program. And then I see Webley has her card up.
Hi, Webley Bowles, WAP Sustainability. My question is about the importers, and have you looked at how many importers fall outside of that $1 million in revenue? I'm curious to know, is that a large gap? Would we be losing information at that scale?
Yeah, that is a great question. There's actually quite a few questions online also about importer reporting requirements. So the million threshold was done looking at a variety of data sources, including Dun and Bradstreet data, as well as existing census data related to imports from non-domestic manufacturers. We believe that the 1 million threshold is likely to account for over 80% of relevant imports. Of course, there is some data gap, and we are definitely looking for additional information if folks do have better resources or information available to help us set a more appropriate threshold for consideration for importer requirements. I'll cut to Raphael.
Good morning, I'm Raphael Sperry with Arup. I'm just wondering if you've also been looking at using CSI codes. Maybe we'll hear about those in the afternoon, but despite my 25 years in the building industry, I've never encountered a NAICS code on a project. So when you're saying, well, you got to know if your steel is recovered by NAICS code, I think that'd be challenging for a lot of people, at least on the design side.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. In the reporting tool that you have, or in the reporting tool that we'll talk about actually this afternoon, we do talk about mapping to building elements. So for those who are more engaged on the building design side or the architecture side or construction side, yeah, we have we've talked about mapping to building elements, and we're aware obviously that there's some common classification systems used for building elements. Obviously, CSI master format probably being the main one. Obviously, OmniFormat being the same, or OmniClass being the same company, I believe. Yeah, I think we've talked about that, and we do have we've kind of talked about having a crosswalk for those that already have that information to report underneath that, so that you can then we can obtain a NAICS for that. Yeah.
Thank you. Reed Hitchcock with the Asphalt Roofing Manufacturers Association. I did want to reiterate some of the concern just about the time frame. Justin talked some about it, the 2 years, just based on the way things work, particularly with PCR and EPD development right now, and the availability of contractors that support these initiatives, what have you. It's a huge concern. The other thing I wanted to bring up, just as a sort of red flag in my mind, is when you're talking about the cost and value of materials, products, any raw materials, what have you, that is a highly competitively sensitive area. And I mean, there's been antitrust cases brought on that kind of data sharing in multiple places. I know for our industry, there's a lot of sensitivity around prices. For importers, I assume that a material distributor is an importer. So if I manufacture an asphalt roofing product in Nevada and it gets sold by a distributor in California, I assume that distributor is an importer. Manufacturers have, confidential pricing with those distributors, what have you. And so I would recommend extreme caution around the cost and value conversation.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. We totally appreciate the fact that it is often viewed as very sensitive to different businesses. And so CARB does collect a lot of confidential business information as part of our regulating and reporting requirements under other programs. We have very strict statutory requirements in place for how we handle confidential business information. And so definitely on reporting fields, we encourage you to mark things as confidential if they are, so that it is protected against anything like a Public Request Act or other things, so it doesn't get out there. And we do adhere to very specific IT practices around maintaining integrity and security over information. So we are aware of these concerns and are hoping to establish systems to adequately protect all of this information. Go ahead.
I'm Bob Pabian, a California architect and software owner for a service to manufacturers of building materials. Just on your feedback questions, I think it was question number 3, if you can go back to. So can you share your thoughts on the common physical unit for materials, in that in each product category, there's quite a variation in relevance?
Yeah, I think that question actually touched on this exactly, which is different products likely have different physical units that are industry standard and more valuable to the industry. And so sharing that so we can actually get a sensible mapping if we do work with things in physical units, that is very useful information to have. I know that there is a desire to standardize things on reporting in tonnage or reporting on declared value, but these are maybe not the units most appropriate for what the industry is used to talking in. And so getting that understanding and mapping will help us better design regulation moving forward.
And I'll save further questions for the public comment, but in terms of those units and whether we're measuring by volume or weight or other metrics, when you compare something like concrete to some other fabricated, assembly or component, it's really important. What are we looking at and why? So I'd be curious over time to understand the source of that expertise or inputs in each product category to understand what those meaningful metrics are per category.
I think hopefully, I think in part, maybe through developing updated PCRs, that might meet some of these requirements, that might be an excellent venue for them to help understand what those units might be. I think, that's why in some ways the value-based accounting, like a spend-based accounting, which obviously is, perhaps more standardized in other construction markets internationally, is perhaps a useful platform because of the fact that it is one indicator across all these different types of elements, whether they're assemblies, takeoffs, fabricated, prefab, raw materials, et cetera, because there's obviously various types of outputs that are coming at lots of different places in the supply chain, all coming to a building site, right, and becoming building materials. And so I think that's why we've pushed that as a concept that kind of works, because it's one standard indicator, one standard classification factor across all those materials. But I think we obviously will be looking to the PCRs too as a place where those groups have come together to define a common physical unit.
One final brief comment related is that you mentioned crosswalk earlier, that there would be a benefit to having some kind of interpretive context, because on regulations, what design professionals like me often do is we just are forced to follow certain things that we don't understand the metrics weren't explained in context. And then we start driving our design decisions as if those metrics matter more than a design assembly or other things that actually have net benefit. If we give the design engineering community, a chance to use our talents to take those components and produce better outcomes to the objective of the overarching efforts by all.
Yeah, thank you. And I think on the project reporting side, that we'll discuss a lot more after lunch. That really is where that interplay comes into effect. I see a bunch of things, so let's just go down in line, I think.
I actually had the same question just about the revenue confidentiality, so that is a concern. But I guess I just want to make sure too on the reporting period. Is it just annually that you're suggesting?
Yeah. So clarification on the reporting period. So the reporting period would be the quarter one deadline would be quarter one of the year after the reporting period. So for the 2026 reporting period, reports would be due at the end of quarter one, 2027. For the 2027 year reporting period, reporting would be due quarter one, 2028, if that made sense. I also see a question online that's similarly related, which is how did CARB determine the $10 million manufacturer and $1 million importer revenue thresholds? $10 million manufacturer threshold was determined by looking at a variety of data sources, including Dun & Bradstreet data for different revenue streams, as well as entities already reporting under California's mandatory reporting requirements for greenhouse gas reporting. And it was determined that this is likely to capture about 70 to 80% of the associated emissions for embodied carbon. So we thought that was a reasonable threshold to aim for the 10 million, and then million I already discussed. And then also in relation to that online is for multi-plant operators, will the reporting threshold apply per facilities or corporate wide? And so the intent was corporate-based 10 million threshold if they're operating multiple facilities. Go ahead, Joseph.
I'm curious about the definition of an importer because that hasn't really been clearly defined. And I'm thinking of an example. I like to think of examples like if I'm a paving contractor, say in Truckee, and I'm bringing in asphalt mix from Reno, for example, am I an importer then of bringing in that product from another state? And then would I be reporting under the importer rule as well as under the project rule requirements that we'll talk about this afternoon? Just trying to clarify in my mind what that means.
Yeah, so I'm sure you had some time to read the 100 pages of material that we dropped last night. And so the importer definition is actually spelled out a little bit more clearly in that. And also, I'll just repeat it here. So the importer is the entity that is primarily liable for the payment of any duties, which is if you're importing from internationally, basically, or the first entity liable for state tax filings on merchandise, or the entity acting on their behalf. So in that situation, likely, yes.
Talk about more about the project. We'll talk more about the project reporting, obviously, in the afternoon session, but the material, so subcontractor material importers, et cetera, are not the primary entity reporting under project reporting. So I think that we'll clarify more about project reporting, but the project, it's pretty clear under statute that the property owner is the primary responsible entity for project reporting. In our prior workshops, we did discuss delegation of project reporting. And so we discussed that that for construction projects, that those reporting responsibilities may be delegated to a responsible entity, an architect, a firm, some other consultant, et cetera, who's actually doing the construction project or the designer for the project, but that the ultimate responsibility for that reporting would be the project owner. So these reporting requirements really are focused on the materials, right? And so that person, that first entity, right, who's responsible for duties, responsible for taxes, would be that person bringing it in. So in that case, obviously, if they're importing materials, they are an importer under that definition.
Marshall Andrews, DPR Construction. I was thinking with the collection of all of these EPDs by CARB, is there going to be like a public searchable database with the EPDs collected, or a way to share with other common databases, something of where we can help kind of see the information to make good product selection? Also with that, will there be any kind of designation, either in a digital EPD or other format, to help designate that it is a CARB compliant EPD? And then lastly, for importers or manufacturers that don't meet the thresholds, is there any way for me as a builder or an architect to know that they are exempt, particularly when we're trying to search for products?
Those are great questions. I don't think we have specific answers on is CARB going to release a database. We haven't really worked through that process of understanding, what kind of data that we can release and are there concerns with releasing specific kinds of data. So that is definitely an area where we would appreciate a more detailed comment letter on what would be very useful and what CARB should consider as creating, public disclosure around for the data that we collect. I mean, if EPDs are being the primary transmission of information to CARB, then, there are other public EPD databases that those might turn up in. But, if it would be beneficial for CARB to host this sort of thing, we would appreciate more comments and details on those kinds of suggestions. And then in terms of entities that are importing or manufacturing that do not meet those thresholds, I think it would be important for the various projects and entities taking those materials to have a pretty good understanding if those entities are exempt from reporting, so that if a project is audited and they do not have records around those kinds of materials that were used, it would be important to have clear indication that those manufacturers are exempt or do not hit the threshold for inclusion.
I think, we did propose two reporting options, right? So there's not, the concept is that it wouldn't be required to produce EPDs. Obviously, a lot of folks are already producing EPDs. So there's a lot of expertise there. And there are already databases, right, that are publicly available. Building Transparency operates EC3. I know most folks are probably aware of that. There's other, data repositories out there that have been proposed or used for EPDs. I think, CARB, obviously, like as Jeff said, we'd really love your feedback on what we can do to, facilitate the exchange of information in this system. But I think the idea with these two reporting options is one is reporting data that is confidential directly to CARB, which would stay with CARB and be confidential information, or report through EPDs, which, based on ISO 1425, it is a type 3. I mean, if it's a type 3 EPD, it's a disclosure that you create for business to business communication and for marketing claims that you intend to share publicly through some forum. Maybe not, maybe selectively, but generally is shared publicly. So I think that's the concept there, is that if, folks want to produce an EPD, or they already do, and they want to use it for other programs, other jurisdictions, other types of voluntary systems for certain types of projects they might request, obviously, certain project owners might be requesting you to do certain types of reporting on materials you obtain. In those cases, those publicly available EPDs would be, would be what you'd want anyway. I think as far as that question about the gaps, I think we'd love to know more about where that might be an issue. I think what we're trying to do in the reporting, as we talked about in prior workshops, is prioritize those material sectors which we recognize as having the highest contribution overall to greenhouse gas emissions from building material use in California's building sector, as well as those materials which are already part of existing green procurement programs. So those kind of efforts, like a Buy Clean, right, which targets certain types of materials. Obviously, we are interested in focusing in on those sectors because there's already a lot of capacity and experience developing EPDs in those sectors, and they represent a large amount of the material that's consumed. I think if there are other materials or other types of products that we should also be thinking about prioritizing for EPD reporting or reporting writ large, that we'd really appreciate that comment, particularly if it's supporting, a construction industry, development, architects, et cetera, who are on the other end of the consumption, right? Because I think what we're talking about is connecting, in the afternoon section, we'll talk more about connecting the dots here, but we are trying to help connect the dots between both sides of this, and that's a pretty clear goal of statute, is increasing the supply of EPD or environmental product type data on building materials, as well as as well as this kind of LCA-based reporting for projects. And so I think that's the kind of feedback I think we'd love to hear.
There's another quick question that I think is worth answering in the Q&A online, which is what happens when an out-of-state entity manufactures a product and also imports it? So if it's an out-of-state entity manufacturing it not inside of California, they would be treated as the importer and would be affiliated with the importer reporting requirements. They would also potentially report under Method 1 or Method 2 reporting, and in lieu of them reporting emissions information to CARB, CARB would assign them conservative default carbon intensity values. I'll now continue with Nathan, and then I think we'll just work our way along the room to Jordan.
Regarding the preference or requirement for primary data within EPDs to be not more than 2 years old, as it stands, EPDs are good for 5 years. So I could generate an EPD and report it for 2026 and 2027, but effectively couldn't use that EPD 28, 29, 30, because by definition, that data would be more than 2 years old. So is CARB effectively saying that EPDs now have a 2-year shelf life instead of 5 years?
I think that the concept we've proposed is, yes, that EPDs would have a shorter shelf life. And we think that is important, but maybe that the EPD would be valid for other programs for a longer period of time, but only be valid for CARB reporting for a certain amount of time or would require updating. So obviously, this would depend on how these requirements are functionalized or implemented through the PCR process. So I think there's some details to work out there that would through the PCR. But for the purpose of CARB reporting, the idea there is that we want to align the systems of EPDs with the systems that we currently use for regulatory reporting. So if you look at existing reporting, like federal reporting through the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program or the state-based reporting through a mandatory Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, those data are much more timely and are reported annually. And so the idea here is that if EPDs are reported as an analog to the types of reporting systems that are currently used by regulatory systems, then those EPDs do need to be updated more frequently. Otherwise, there's a real disparity with respect to what's being reported when, right? We could have data that's reported that's quite a bit older, and now, and the EPD being valid for 5 years, and the primary data, you could have data in there that's 12 years old, that's reflected in that EPD while that EPD is still valid. And I think, like I said, if we want to make comparable data reporting across these different types of programs, it will require EPDs to be updated more frequently. Move down, Jordan, there.
Hi there. Jordan Palmieri with the Carbon Leadership Forum and University of Washington. First of all, thank you so much. Clearly, the CARB staff has put a lot of time and effort and thought into the program development, so I really appreciate it. My question is about facility level reporting. The question is, are you defining any cutoff criteria for some of the upstream Scope 3 inputs? In other words, what's in and what's out for measurement of upstream Scope 3?
So I assume that's more of a question about method 2, or is that about the method 1 EPD? You're talking method 2 specifically? Yeah, so those would be specific facility inputs, and then CARB would have, the tools we released have emissions factors affiliated with those inputs. So if you draw a system boundary around the facility, that would be inputs coming into the facility. And so the cutoff is directly at all the data the facility has information on for the operation of the facility, not upstream of that for an external facility producing the input. That would already be encapsulated in the emissions factor that CARB is providing. Did that answer your question?
I just add clarify is that, so we have published a set of proposed default emissions factors for Scope 3 emissions for facilities that we would expect facilities to use under the reporting pathway.
Okay, thanks. So if there isn't an emissions factor published for an upstream input, then it would be out of scope?
I believe the emissions factors that we have should encapsulate all upstream inputs.
I think in the answer to that question is, if you can identify anything in the emissions factor database that is not covered currently, we would love to hear about it so that we can make sure that we publish a more comprehensive set of Scope 3 emissions factors.
Okay, thank you. I look forward to reviewing those.
Yeah.
Hi again, Raphael Sperry with Arup. I think I understand how this might apply to chain of custody, and I'm hoping that it doesn't seem like it would require companies to set up chain of custody systems, because my impression is that's really burdensome on manufacturers who I've talked to. But it seems like, on the other hand, if they wanted to offer some products that were low carbon products and others that were not, then they might be required to have a chain of custody system. Like if you, do ornamental metal detailing and you're like, well, I've got this special green steel that's one of my inputs, and you want to sell some products that are low carbon steel stairs, right? And then others that are just standard. The facility would have to have some process for assuring that the low carbon steel that they got from their specialty manufacturer was used in those products that they market that way. So they'd be kind of running 2 separate EPDs or something like that for you.
I'm going to try to unpack that question a little bit. So it's on facilities trying to change the carbon intensities affiliated with inputs into the facility so that their finished product would have a likely a lower carbon, marketable carbon intensity for the finished product. Is that kind of where the question is?
Yeah, I think some
Okay.
would like to do that and others would.
So
want to force it to that.
under the EPD, so method one reporting pathway, if they do source that and the entity that they're sourcing the materials from also does a EPD meeting CARB affiliated EPD requirements that would reflect a different carbon intensity in the method one for that input material. The CARB standard also requests that the facility disclose the carbon intensity with the default carbon emission factors as well. So that would basically create a benchmark for comparison across life cycle categories within an EPD. So I guess that would then, yeah, that company could have potential marketable benefits, in the voluntary market or other things. It's not clear what they would necessarily choose to do with that, but that would be, data that would be reflected in the EPD. It's not clear how CARB would necessarily use that. That is a different kind of regulatory discussion moving forward. And then under method one, they would only have the default carbon intensity affiliated with that input. So there would not be this, green claim that they would be able to make for that specific sourcing. We do not allow for designation of sourcing within the current template that we've released. I would then put maybe an asterisk by that, which is if the facility is located in California and that input is also a regulated material, that imported quantity would be reporting some emissions data to us, and then that would be linked through some sort of form of product source disclosure. So that information would be available to CARB, but I don't know if that would allow the company to make marketable claims using the method two kind of reporting pathway.
Yeah. So just clarify, I think it's hard with the ones and twos, but so if under the facility reporting, right, the reporting directly to CARB under the facility specific data, we would request, the proposal, the concept is that folks would use standardized sets of scope 3 emission factors. So essentially you would use your scope 3 emission factor that we would define. And I think there's a lot of methodological purpose and rationale behind that that we could probably get into in a longer discussion if folks want to over lunch. But I think, that under the EPD pathway, we request that results would be reported with the default as well. And we think that, these are proposals that actually you saw reflected probably in the Environmental Protection Agency's standards that they had put forth, the data quality standards for construction materials in EPDs that had been published a couple years ago. And so, and under those proposed requirements, you saw disaggregation of reporting for these different types of attributes. And that was to increase the transparency really and to increase the reliability, and also allows, sort of an EPD to be read with a comparison right there, right? There's like sort of a benchmark right there. Imagine on your cereal box, if it showed you the average amount of sugar in every box of cereal and then said how much sugar and how much sodium is in this one, that might be pretty helpful. I think that's kind of a similar analog to this. And I see a similar question online about clarification on these emissions factors. So it wouldn't be that we would ask folks to publish two separate EPDs that use CARB emission factors and also whatever's defined in the PCR. The idea is that the EPD should provide transparency on both, right? So it should provide this benchmark comparison with a consistent set of emissions factors, which we've made public and are obviously open to feedback on. We're open to receive comments on it. And so the EPDs would be produced at a more frequent pace with both this kind of benchmark comparison number baked in, as well as supply chain specific data where appropriate that can be verified by the EPD generator.
Yeah, I guess I did open up a lot of stuff. I guess where I'm going, and we haven't had the project disclosure, but I guess I'm just wondering if there's going to be an incentive created here for manufacturers to reduce their carbon because projects are looking for lower carbon materials because there are regulations on them, or is it really just like, well, we're just requiring everybody to reduce their carbon in the manufacturing process?
I mean, at this point, we're focused on developing a reporting regulation,
Okay.
right? And you notice we have a slide we've shared a few times in the workshop process here that really outlines the 3 key goals of statute and the timeline for those goals: developing a framework for measuring the carbon intensity of building materials, developing a comprehensive strategy for achieving reductions, and achieving a net reduction target of 40%. I think, right now we're just focused on the first step of getting reporting, because we recognize there are a lot of challenges with data availability, data quality, and gaps in the space that we need to develop a common set of understanding of metrics, right? So that we can then move towards identifying strategies, right, which would be reduction strategies. We obviously also have a number of existing CARB programs, which also are targeting different types of reduction strategies. For example, there was a Senate Bill 596, which was a net zero cement strategy. That strategy has a draft strategy that's been published, which identifies a number of strategies for cement producers to reduce their emissions. We think that there's going to be existing strategies which will also perhaps work towards our reduction targets, our reduction goals for this program. After we adopt the strategy, we will then look at adopting targets that may or may not require additional regulatory measures. So I think it's a couple steps down the road on perhaps any type of additional measures that would push on reduction targets, like you said.
That's a really helpful answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
There's a question that I want to jump to online, and then I think we can wrap this way, and then we'll go to Webley and then back up to Joseph. So if a company manufactures in-state, but also has facilities out of state that may be selling product into California as well, which category would that fall under? So the in-state facility is very clearly a manufacturing facility operating in the state. If they are manufacturing regulated building materials, they would report emissions to us. If the facilities outside of the state send to a different facility that then sends into California, those out-of-state facilities may not be reporting emissions under the program. If the facility is doing regulated building materials that then directly go into California, there'll be importers, and then they would also potentially report under Method 1 and Method 2 or Method 2 reporting pathways. So I think a shorter answer of that is it's very likely that all of your facilities would be reporting information under this program. Yep.
Sorry, you guys hadn't seen my my name tag back there, so we put it up there. Lisa Podesto, employed by Swinnerton Builders, but also a member of the Structural Engineers Association of California Sustainable Design Committee, and also sit on the Joint Institute for Wood Product Innovation through the Board of Forestry. I had a few questions that kind of compiled over time here. A few people mentioned the opportunity that perhaps exists to create a CARB-specific EPD that might alleviate some direct reporting requirements, which I think could be both an incentive and a value to CARB. So I think that is something that should be explored in general. Also, my question about the 2-year interval on EPDs. If there was a way to, I mean, it seems like really that time interval is there to capture changes or modifications made in the process or in some way, shape, or form. So if there was a way to not tie it to a time frame, but rather tie it to like significant modifications in process, that might help with I guess that requirement. And then there was in one of the slides, it mentioned that renewable energy credits and carbon offsets were not going to be applicable under the EPD, but I'm curious if I understood that correctly, and if really that's more of a transparency and a like describing that in that reporting, because it seems like you want to encourage that behavior, and if this is the one place they can actually take financial credit for paying for these offsets and renewable energy credits, it seems like counterproductive.
Thank you. Those are great comments. I'll work through, I think the first one was a comment, so I'll work through the second question and third question. The second question, I think, we've proposed this 2-year period. We have used a annual basis as that period of update. I think we're very open to feedback on that concept. I think, there could be a number of ways as someone who has worked on developing EPDs and practice LCA for a long time, I think, I'm aware of different ways perhaps a verifier or an EPD preparer might interpret that primary data requirement. Maybe an attestation that the data are consistent, depending on the data period it was gathered for. It might not require necessarily a significant regathering of the data if the data are consistent. I think that there's probably some discussion there about how those data are gathered, and obviously we haven't necessarily prescribed exactly. We've provided some guidance on what we would like for primary data gathering, but I think we're interested in receiving feedback on that. And so if it was a project-based change to production processes, I think that's a concept that we could consider. But there, I think, are challenges with that because there's going to be thresholds on when you would trigger it, et cetera. And that still wouldn't necessarily reflect perhaps changes in co-products or products that are produced at the plant. So if you had to change a production facility, if you had to change just with respect to the share of products that are produced, that could necessarily change your emissions allocation for the EPD preparation. So like I said, the 2-year right now is a concept we put forward. I think we're interested in hearing how we can how that could be actualized as well, and also feedback on what's feasible. I think the second question regarding the environmental attributes, so things like chain of custody certification issues, renewable energy credits, bundled or unbundled renewable energy credits. You mentioned, I believe, carbon offsets. I think we've been talking about this as a market-based accounting, which I think many folks are aware of, using kind of some type of market-based accounting in the estimation of the primary impacts for global warming potential. Obviously, EPDs use a lot of market-based accounting or product source claims in preparation. Fair trade certifications, FSC, et cetera. Ethical sourcing, conflict-free. So there's a lot of different types of product source market-based accounting methods that are used in EPDs currently. We did not propose that they were not used. We proposed that results would be reported with and without. And as I said, this aligns, I think, with some of the existing standards that have been put forward for improving data quality in EPDs. Most notably, I think the Environmental Protection Agency's draft EPD data quality standards, which were put forward in 2024. Those, I think, also offered that you would report results both with and without these types of environmental attributes to increase the transparency of the EPD. I think there are, as an agency, I think we do have, existing programs which have developed approaches for dealing with these types of claims and these types of attributes. And I think we want to make sure that we want to ensure that we have consistency in how we're approaching those types of systems. Does that help?
Yes. There was, I guess, an add-on to one of my questions that wasn't maybe, how are fabricators being considered within the scope of, for instance, a primary manufacturing and secondary manufacturing, but then there's fabricators who are basically taking commodities and mixing them with multiple materials and making an end product. Are those fabricators going to be seen as subcontractors and reporting under a different framework, or are they like, where does that line come? And do they need to create their own EPDs, or are they just basically taking the EPDs from the product, from the materials that they're utilizing and passing it through project reporting?
I think those are great questions. I think it would depend on a lot of ifs. So for example, are they dealing with regulated materials? Are they above the thresholds that we've proposed? So assuming that they're a fabricator that's doing X amount of revenue that's above the threshold, assuming that they're working within the regulated material that's already covered by the program, then they would be a manufacturer, essentially, and so they would be reporting their material. But like I said, it would require them to meet those other thresholds as well. And so I think my understanding is that, at least with respect to fabrication for for finished products, some of the finished products that we would see, that there would probably be a limited number of those that would actually, be within all the circles of the Venn diagram underneath those. But I think these are the types of considerations we'd love to hear more on. So if you have specific examples of fabricators, which, would be within these different bins and need to meet perhaps the reporting requirements of the program, we'd love to learn more about, where those types of industries. We've been trying to do a lot of outreach, in hosting these workshops and hosting prior public workshops. Very interested in having more engagement with stakeholders. So please, like I said, if you have examples, if you have more information, we'd love to talk more to you about it.
I do. So,
Yeah.
okay.
Great.
I'm going to jump to a question that was asked online real quick, and then we'll continue up the chain for a little bit. It was mentioned that recommended limits would be considered by CARB after the reporting period. More specifically, does CARB anticipate developing limits on phase 1 after the 2026 reporting period, or would it be one of the later reporting periods? I think this question is related into, are there reduction targets or limits that would be applied to carbon intensity thresholds? And so we have not discussed limits at this stage. That would be, if you go back to our informational slide, we're in the reporting concept development period. After that, we will be moving to the strategy development. And then if in our strategy development, we do identify additional needs for reduction targets or reductions across the building sector space, that's where a discussion on limits and other policy methods to achieve the overall 40% net reduction target would come into discussion. I hope that helps. And then, let's continue.
First and foremost, thank you for the public disclosure, discussion. I think this is amazing. I'm Taylor from Built Cold. We help agencies deploy buy clean programs. Almost every state you've mentioned, we've supported. And our questions around, I'm going to kind of follow on Lisa's note around the 2-year shelf life for an EPD. Has CARB, in the CARB concept, have you defined, maybe this is in the 100-page report that I haven't read yet, apologies, but when would be the EPDs be submitted? We've seen for different buy clean policies, EPDs submitted at time of bid, at percent completion of the project, in the design phase, at closeout, at procurement, and that would obviously change the shelf life challenge.
Good question. So it depends on which entity you're talking about doing the reporting. So I think on the project reporting that we will get into this afternoon, that's one of the questions that we actually have, and we have some concepts around it. So we'll discuss that a little bit more. In terms of manufacturers, importer reporting, that would be the deadline that we have put forward in the concept would be Q1 for which the year of reporting is due. So Q1 2027 would cover the 2026 reporting period. So all manufactured products that end up getting used in California, they would need to submit either method 1 or method 2 reporting by Q1 2027. On the projects, that's a little bit of a different discussion. Also, you've brought up the 100 pages plus of material that we have released. We also have gotten a couple of questions online about that. I believe Alex has pasted into the chat a link for it, but for those that have not seen, we have a CARB embodied carbon page. The easiest way I find to find the page is to Google CARB embodied carbon, and then click on the workshop links. And within the workshops, there is a link that says technical meeting materials. It's under the 2 staff presentations that we'll be going over. Click on that. There's all of the material there, which includes written, more detailed, documented discussion around the concepts for reporting for manufacturers and importers and concepts for reporting for the projects. There's also the 3 reporting templates affiliated with manufacturer reporting, and then the 1 reporting template affiliated with project reporting. Definitely spend time reviewing that. We do have a fairly large public comment period for everyone to work through that material, look into it, and then submit comments on it. We also definitely encourage you to reach out to us and set up meetings to discuss things further. We recognize that this is a large drop of information. We also understand that we're starting to get close to a holiday season, so we encourage folks to do their best reading through this and reaching out to us to engage over it, given time constraints and flexibility that people have. I hope that clarified that.
I will note that for anyone on Zoom, the actual easiest way to access it is via the link I just dropped in the chat.
Go to Justin and then Webley, and then we'll take a few online.
Thank you, Justin with PIMA. I only have 2 questions now because I think Lisa nailed it with her comment on the 2-year period. I think the only reasonable justification would be that you're trying to capture rapid change. We're the construction industry, and I think we embrace innovation, but we still build houses the same way we built houses 30, 40 years ago. So I'm not sure we're moving at the speed that the chip industry is at innovation. You've sent clear market signals. Manufacturers, if they've made improvements in their processes or their raw materials, are going to want to capture that with updated EPDs. Structurally, your program is going to require that you demonstrate reductions. So I think that capturing change will take care of itself. I'm pleased, Mr. Ambrose, you suggested that there might be kind of an attestation type route to satisfying that 2-year rather than basically being set on a path to be continually collecting and updating EPD reports. I still might go home and incorporate an EPD company after this, but so my 2 questions are, 1, can you clarify if you're a national manufacturer, only facilities that produce material that is imported to California would be required to satisfy these? So that's question 1. And then if you don't mind going to slide 3 on your feedback. Oh, I'm sorry. Slide 3 of 3 on your feedback questions there. No, I sent you in the wrong. Oh. Yeah. So on like the reporting, are there alternatives for reporting? If you are hypothetically an insulation industry that does not manufacture any insulation product in California, all of your information is going to be reported by importers. And there may be a significant number of importers. If there was data for product shipped to California, could you envision sort of an exception whereby that material could be reported by that type of national data set versus having thousands of importers report what they brought into the state? I don't know if I'm trying to make that into a concise question, but could data sets be used as surrogates for importer purchasing data, especially where it's exclusively going to be reported by importers?
Interesting question. I would definitely encourage laying out a written comment kind of that outlines and details your thinking a little bit more on that. I would posit a question back, which is if you have other suggestions for how we can get accurate quantity data for what's being imported, I think that would be great and informative. From conversations that we've had with various folks, we understand that there's a real gap in supply chain transparency around what actually comes into the state and where stuff goes once it kind of leaves the hands of the immediate manufacturer. And so if you do have other concepts where CARB can get that quantity data to assess emissions, right? Emission totals, not just product carbon intensities, that would be great. I'd like to remind everyone that the statutory requirement is to assess a 40% net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So that greenhouse gas emissions is quantities times carbon intensities. And so there's both the need to understand carbon intensities of products and materials, as well as the quantities of materials that get used in the state. And so, yeah, we're open to suggestions and ideas and alternatives to kind of implement and affect that statutory requirement.
That first question, only facilities that produce product that then is imported are covered by the proposed reporting requirements?
Yeah, so entities whose products are used in the state of California are the entities that would be covered under this regulation, potentially.
If I have a plant in Maine and a plant in Texas, and only the plant in Texas sends product to California,
then that's all, yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Lovely, you wanna?
There's so many great questions being asked. I really appreciate everyone's questions because you're answering some of mine. Just picking off what Justin just said, it seems like there's a way for CARB to kind of set up manufacturers so that the importers have the right data. So just wanted to kind of mention that. It's like, is there a way that you can have, maybe you have an importer that is less experienced in this, and so how can the manufacturer support them through that process? My question goes back to the reporting and kind of what's being reported. So it was mentioned that, Jeff, I think you mentioned that the manufacturer's products that's used, and maybe this is all in the definitions, is what's being reported, but is it what is produced, what is sold, what is used? And then for the importers, is it what is purchased, sold, or used? Like, what are they actually reporting in that year? Is it like end of year clearance? We got to get all this out.
Yeah, so if it's regulated building material, that would be imported into California. And so we've released the NAICS codes to identify, as well as the HS codes to basically lay out a broad scope of what should be within that regulated building material net. So if those quantities get imported into California, there would be the quantity reporting requirements on the importers, as well as some emissions information that gets established for those imported quantities. If the manufacturer is in the state, unless the manufacturer were to demonstrate that the quantities are exported and leave the state to us, it would otherwise be assumed that those quantities that are being reported are used within the state and they're regulated materials, and so that would count towards the quantities.
So I think my question is around like the use. So manufacturers will create it and they might stockpile it there until it's going somewhere else. So is it what's manufactured in that year or what is being sold in that year?
For imported quantities, it would be what is imported within that threshold year. So if the importer imports it, it's stored and then exported. Under our current reporting concept, we would not have that exported quantity affiliated with that material. We'd only have that imported quantity on that time horizon. For a manufacturer in state, it's assumed that it was manufactured in that year, so the quantities reported would be for the quantity manufactured in that year.
Great. I want to jump in and take a few comments online, but I also want to just respond really quickly. You know, Justin, I think I think the I don't want to totally disconnect these, but maybe there's the difference in the pace of play in construction and the pace of play in product development on the materials side. You know, I think there obviously is development in new materials and continual development, particularly in certain product categories, right? Maybe not all materials are developing at the same pace, but some building materials, you know, probably go through relatively discontinuous, time horizons where they are developing quite quickly. And I think with respect to EPD updates, it's, you know, we want to make sure that EPDs are reflecting what's actually being produced. And, you know, the emissions intensity of that product might change based on the throughput. It might change based on, you know, how much is produced, right? So a given manufacturer, you know, might be producing more in a given year. They might increase their throughput. and that might actually reduce their carbon intensity. And so it might be in their best interest sometimes to update those EPDs to better reflect that data. So I think that's why we're suggesting this kind of temporal horizon of 2 years. As I said, I think we really appreciate some comments on how to implement that in a way that doesn't increase the burdens for industry. I think the cost of generating an EPD is something that we understand relatively well, but obviously we don't necessarily understand what industry expects the cost to be to increase the pace of data monitoring. But I do think that there is some challenges with just trying to think about a longer time horizon, given the variability in production schedules for some facilities, perhaps.
And I don't disagree with your analysis. I guess my point was that you described sort of the market drivers for a manufacturer wanting to pursue updating that information. And to me, that would maybe argue against needing or requiring a rigid 2-year rule. Because if I'm undertaking these, I'm going to want to capture them somehow. EPDs are the tool right now that you can capture and communicate that advantage to the marketplace. So I would think that would be a parallel strategy to a manufacturer who's investing in these types of innovations that will make, how do you define it, but a meaningful difference between the status quo product in the new product. So, I mean, this would be obviously a point that a lot of people comment.
As a regulatory program, obviously, we don't want to only receive data when the results are going down, right? So I think that's the other challenge here is that while that's true, we want to ensure that we have accurate data that's consistently reported because that is the basis of existing regulatory programs.
Yeah, and you could solve that, and some of the tools do it, like EC3. You have a confidence factor, so perhaps there's a way to have confidence factors applied to information that would also send signals to manufacturers or incentivize them to update that. So the reverse isn't true, that you just stick with old information because it's better than today's information.
Absolutely. And as I said, we appreciate that kind of written comments. I want to dive into a few comments online, if that's okay. Oh, Bob first. Go ahead, Bob, if you want to jump in.
Just a statement about, since we're at a crawl, walk, run, first stage, just focusing on materials, not focusing on tools for projects necessarily. When we see disparity between a given product and another, a material and another, and one seems to be at a material level, a bigger offender, just to use some loose language on that, it doesn't necessarily equate to that material being a problem in its net use, which will be further developed and understood over time. So I do think that early stage, when I look at a report and see charts, my peers as well look at those charts and go, these are bad materials apparently, and looked at a material level. And so just the suggestion that there is a sensitivity to how much weight we put on data at this stage and what the public is understanding that to mean. Because of your point, let's build on really solid data first at a material level. And then there's all kinds of per product category variations on that. And therefore, I think assessing the pros and cons of a given material at this early stage via these tools is just something to be sensitive to.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a great comment. I've seen a number of comments online related to EPD questions, and I just want to kind of knock a few of them out. There's some questions here about existing EPD databases, namely C3. And, as I kind of talked about earlier, I think that the value of the two options that we've presented today as concepts for manufacturing reporting is that one is an option for directly reporting data confidential directly to CARB, and another one for producing EPDs, with the industry already has expertise, which could be used in existing EPD databases, and obviously CARB could leverage perhaps existing approaches to digital EPDs and other types of systems that are already out there that industry favors. I think there's a couple questions here just on clarification. We just want to, on the updates on EPDs and then on secondary manufacturing, and we can try to go back and for folks just to clarify though, if you did arrive late, if you missed any part of this workshop, we are recording onto Zoom. We will post the Zoom recording. The materials are available on our website. So if you missed any portion of the discussion today and we didn't have time to address your comment, please, please review the materials online. Let me keep going down here. We did talk about allocation systems earlier. And we did say that we would like to see both physical allocation as well as economic allocation in the context of the EPD results for primary impacts for global warming potential. We think that's an important consideration given the challenges with correctly allocating emissions. Obviously, under the existing ISO 14000 series, allocation systems, you should be using multiple allocation systems, either subdivision or economic or mass-based allocation in comparison for LCAs. Obviously, the EPDs generally report only one of those results, but that doesn't mean that the LCA is exempt from considering them. We're asking that the EPD does produce both results, which I think will really increase transparency as far as the results of the LCA that underpins that EPD, as well as really increasing the value of the EPD itself for many products which may or may not have high-value co-product outputs. There's questions on, there's another question here related to product-specific, facility-specific, and the type of EPD. I think in the documentation we provided, we've tried to be really clear that we are looking for facility and product-specific environmental product declarations. So these would be specific to each facility and each product that is produced at that facility. Now, we have put forward two concepts for reporting. So for those facilities that produce many co-products, direct facility reporting might be a more economical solution if you find that you would have to produce a large number of EPDs for that particular facility. But obviously, we are interested in getting feedback on the appropriate aggregation or specificity for certain types of product categories. And so if there's feedback from specific manufacturing or for specific sectors on challenges perhaps with splitting hairs on different types of products within your product stream, perhaps that's a great comment that we could receive. And yeah, so I said product and facility specific is the proposal. There's also a comment here, looks like maybe perhaps from our colleagues at Department of Government Services related to product category rules. So we talked a little bit about the hope that, we know with awareness that any standards that we are, or concepts for standards we're presenting today or would adopt in the future would need to be adopted through the PCR process. And obviously there's various program administrators out there that operate these PCRs at various timetables, and I'm aware that it's a time-consuming process to get the PCRs updated. We think that that's something that we want to talk to folks more about. We're looking for more engagement on that. I'm hoping we can perhaps convene folks together, perhaps in a separate forum, PCR program operators and PCR participants to have a deeper dive on discussing the implementation of these standards. I think there is going to be a challenge in thinking about these complex assemblies, which may or may not be governed directly under PCRs. For example, obviously you might have a takeoff that's developed, some kind of wall assembly, curtain wall assembly that has various types of elements, fenestrations, windows, concrete elements, and that comes as a prefabbed assembly to your construction site. I think that is going to be the connection between project reporting and manufacturing reporting that we want to talk about in the afternoon. Obviously, there is going to be this need to connect the ecosystem of data that's bubbling up from manufacturers, also through importers, as Webley noted, to project sites, such that we can inform design decisions at the construction site in that sector. I think that's it. Oh, and obviously, if there are other tools out there, we mentioned digital EPD standards. I've been hoping folks would bring forward some suggestions of how we should go about integrating a digital EPD submission. I think that's definitely something we'd like to consider, and I'm looking for folks in the room and experts to help me understand which would be a preferred choice. I'm aware of the platforms that are out there and some of the approaches, obviously. But if there are tools or specific approaches that you're aware of or that have been developed, please provide us some public comments on those. We'd really like to hear more. Okay. I see Joseph has his card up if we want to go back to the in-room.
I'm going to apologize. I've got 3 comments here. Comments, questions, discussion points. First of all, on the Q1 reporting timeline for the previous year, as I'm thinking through this, I'm starting to get a little bit concerned about that timeline in terms of verification of EPDs, because as a manufacturer, you're collecting, let's say it's 2025 data, reporting in 2026, just as an example. I've got all my manufacturing data. Probably is going to take me a couple of months to compile all that data, and then develop my EPD and then get that verified. Currently, ISO is in the process of updating updating their standards, which includes the verification requirements. I anticipate those will get more stringent than they are today. And we have, the last I understood, fewer than 10 verifiers in the US. And now we're talking about many more EPDs being verified more frequently. So I'm a little concerned about the time crunch there. So you might want to think about an extended time period on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And so we were hoping to address some of that with a staff concept on the two different methods for reporting. So the EPD time crunch would actually be 2030, and pre-2030, the method 2 reporting option we think would be much more attainable within the reporting time horizons that we've put forward.
Right. Yeah, really good point. The second is, I'm gonna dive into the weeds, but stay high level on this. I'm thinking about state of California's low carbon fuel standard and incorporating these low carbon fuels, the data around them, into data sets that are LCA data sets that are being used, like the federal LCA Commons, for example. We don't have, for example, like a consumption mix of renewable diesel or renewable natural gas that's sold in the California market as a data set in the LCA Commons. And that would be incredibly valuable for California manufacturers who are using those fuels to be able to kind of pull that data into their EPDs, because currently they're sort of living in two different worlds. So just a thought on kind of ways to improve data quality overall. I'm not sure if you've kind of gone down that road internally or not, but it's worth thinking about. And then the third one, thinking about adding economic allocation to basically all EPDs. Thinking about this in terms of a typical ready mix or asphalt producer. Right now we're using mass allocation, by ton, metric ton, short ton, or whatever. When you start talking about economic allocation, that means they have to track their revenue per ton of mix produced and sold. And oftentimes their revenue is variable depending on project-specific contracts. Oftentimes those contracts are in a lump sum approach where they're not generating a revenue that's directly attributable to that mix. It's just the performance of a contract. So there's probably some thought that needs to go into how to track that, and also giving those manufacturers time to create data systems to track that as well. It starts to get a little more complex than just say, oh, economic, this will work great. And then you dig into it and it's more to it.
Yeah, thanks. We definitely would like more information on that, and would encourage you to submit a written comment on that, or reach out to us for more detailed discussion on that topic. And I see, Lisa, you have your card raised in the back over there.
Can I just clarify, is this the open comment period at this point, or no? Not yet?
Great question. I think given that I don't see any more cards raised other than yours, and that we're at 11:17, I think we should move into the public comment period. So let me just do a brief announcement for people on Zoom. So for those of you on Zoom, please use the raise hand feature if you have a comment you would like to make. We will unmute you, let you know that you can unmute yourself and begin talking. So there is a two-part unmuting here. We will unmute you, and then you also need to unmute yourself, and then you'll be able to talk. And we will go through public comments on Zoom in the order that we see hands raised. And then everyone else in the room will enter the comment period, and so you can do the continued signaling with raising your card, and we'll try to do the best we can to do it in a reasonable time frame for when cards appear raised. Go ahead, Lisa.
Thank you. Okay, so I have two comments. The first one is just a recognition that the cost of doing business in California is significantly more than doing it outside of California. And I think that, especially with regards to building materials and commodities within the construction industry, there should be some thought given to how we can encourage manufacturing to remain within the state, and not go external. And while the CARB regulations are going to apply to folks who are outside of the state and within the state, there are additional requirements that basically essentially are taxing businesses to do operations within the state. I think this is an opportunity to create a dynamic for that incentivization. And I will say that that if this is like sales tax sales tax is a huge differentiation with regards to the cost of construction in California and outside of California, just to do construction. And if we're increasing the cost of our materials, which is what the sales tax gets applied to, you're compounding costs not just on the materials itself, but also the cost of that you're paying in sales tax for these materials. And that, to me, creates the dynamic where if you were to create a tax incentive, either tax credit or a tax exemption that's either associated with low carbon impact materials or perhaps in the beginning a CARB verified EPD that has shown certain reduction, first it's just transparency. I think this is a way to both impact the current cost of construction dynamic and also empower the folks that are going to be doing the right things within the state. So I will say that I think that part of the connecting those two things together is also to say that the dollar value spent in prevention is worth a lot more than what California as a state would be paying in mitigation to the impact on climate risk. My second comment here is, I guess, going back to this comment about fabricators in general and prefabricators. A lot of the conversation around materials right now is like assuming business as usual, right? And I think that the construction industry in general is having a really hard time shifting from, buying commodity materials and putting all this labor on site and putting a building together. If we don't start thinking about how to put these regulations together so that they're directly inferable to this prefabrication market, then it kind of makes everybody want to go the route of just traditional because the processes are all set up, it's clear, I know what I have to do. So my thought is that an EPD at a prefabricator level in some ways disincentivizes that action to happen. Why? Because the dollar value, most of the dollar value of their product is purchased in the materials that they're using. They're putting value add onto this in order to resale that. And I would argue that if there was a way to say the environmental impact that you're putting into that product is less than a certain percentage, then you don't need to create an EPD. And that the reporting that you're doing actually goes in through the project reporting as a subcontractor. because it doesn't make sense that if you're not doing a lot on the material realm, and this is a material focused thing, that you need to go through all the value of an EPD. And I could see that the dollar value being high for a lot of these prefabricators because they're buying large volumes of materials. So with that, I think that those are my two comments.
Yeah.
Great. I see you have your placard raised. Is that for a comment?
So an important aspect of all of this early work is to ask or be able to answer the question, why are we taking a certain path on a given effort here? And I know that right now the why is to achieve an overall reduction, right? Hit say a 40% target. So just a suggestion is at this earliest stage, when there is such diversity in a product category view, how do we get the material experts in the various categories just to the table and in that discussion? Because I think meetings like this are fantastic, and your willingness to just welcome that input, and that's a wonderful posture to take throughout, obviously. But I think we're not going to be able to attract enough of the experts in their given categories unless there's a very specific invitation, intent, campaign, if you will, nurture that kind of connection at this stage so that those experts can more clearly articulate some of the various use cases, some of the 80-20 kind of concepts around a given product category that would give you enough of the context to start deliberating, more effectively. And I've spoken with a lot of people over the years, last 30 years in town, who are charged with making, legislative or policy decisions. And their Achilles heels is it's hard to get to the experts often enough and early enough. So just a suggestion that if we all could be aware of the importance of that, because everyone else downstream of that input is highly affected by whatever path was taken. I just want to underscore that expertise importance at this earliest stage.
Thanks. I think I appreciate that comment. I think, we're trying obviously to put out these concepts for discussion as quickly as we can in the regulatory process. Right now, we are focused on developing the reporting regulation. And part of the value, I think, on just focusing on the reporting is that it'll allow us to, surface data and create some, improve some standards for data gathering such that we can move forward more cohesively and collectively towards identifying reduction strategies. And those strategies, they can be a number of things. I think we've heard people talk about, I've heard some comments, I've seen comments that might be related to strategies, such as, digital EPDs, support for EPD generation, verification. These are, those could be strategies that CARB could consider as part of our comprehensive strategy if they're needed to support achieving a target. And so I think those are all really helpful comments. I think when we think about strategies, we're not just thinking you're putting CCUS at your plant. The strategies can be wide-ranging with respect to incentives or other types of measures to support or facilitate the evolution perhaps of the industry towards these types of data gathering standards or data quality standards. So I appreciate that. I want to just maybe grab a couple of comments from online really fast. I think, we talked a lot about in this that there would be two options for reporting. We've proposed that because statute articulates clearly that our goal is to gather data for the 2026 calendar year, that we would have reporting in the first quarter of 2027. That's the concept as proposed. Obviously, there was some, comments about the feasibility of that under the different reporting pathways. We look forward to seeing comments from folks on what they suggest might be a feasible timeline for reporting. Statute does lay out a pretty clear requirement that we're trying to gather data for that 2026 calendar year. So I just want to emphasize that. But obviously, we want to ensure that any regulation we adopt is, simple, is administratable, is implementable, and produces as few burdens as possible on the regulated community. And so under that proposal, we haven't under the concepts, we haven't proposed collecting EPDs that are currently available today. So we know there are programs, including at our partner agencies, like I mentioned, Buy Clean California, that are collecting some amounts of currently available EPDs. We're pretty aware of EPDs that are out in the market. We too have access to these publicly available databases, including EC3. And as part of this proposal, we aren't suggesting from the manufacturing side that there would be additional reporting of currently available EPDs. That's just a question that I had online. And I mentioned, that when we talk about, as we move forward in this process, we're interested in comments on the needs and challenges, and that those comments might well inform future actions we take with respect to developing a comprehensive strategy. So while you might identify, challenges with meeting reporting requirements, that might be a comment that can help inform our future activities as well. And finally, we've been talking about, product and facility specific EPDs. And that really stems from the language in the existing legacy of the TSC, ISO 14000, and how EPDs are defined under the ISO standards. So I see some questions with respect to how families of products or different types of products are grouped together. I think that the goal is to articulate that would be essentially defined through the PCR process. And that, as we've said, the existing nomenclature that's used to refer to product and facility specific would be what we're expressing as well. And so there might be product facility specific that, might have different colors or different types of aesthetics, which could be classified as the same product from the same facility. And that would really be defined in the PCR. And so we would be looking to those PCRs to help define those groupings. And I think that the reason that we're focused on that, there are other carbon accounting standards out there. The World Resources Institute, produces the GHG protocol, also produces a carbon accounting standard for products. The strength, I think, of the ISO standard is the PCR process, which creates this opportunity for industry engagement at a pretty fine level to ensure that the reporting standards and data that are used are agreed upon and available to all the stakeholders. So I think that's one of the reasons that we're focused on that particular approach, in addition to the fact that obviously statute does cite the ISO standards there. Okay, I see Justin has a card up. We can go back in the room.
Justin Kosher with Pima, and I did want to compliment staff, especially with respect to the discussion on method one. I think you're kind of acutely aware that what CARB's proposing here is not happening in a vacuum. So whether it be what you're proposing and changes needing to be made at the PCR level to enable that, or the reality that people probably aren't going to maintain two different types of EPDs, one for California and one for the rest of North America. But maybe one thing that didn't get mentioned is I have to imagine that when this statute was created, it was also done in a backdrop of what was happening at the federal level at that time. And obviously, both from just a pure momentum, but also importantly, a financial standpoint, the picture is very different today. And I think the language in the authorizing statute provides CARB with enough flexibility maybe to consider that broader context, that what may have been possible with billions of dollars of infusion into this sector may not be as possible today without that level of federal commitment and federal support. So I just encourage us to also think as we go forward, that broader context that had to have been playing in the back of the legislator's mind when they authorized this statute. And today we're just in a very different environment, which is probably going to make things move more slowly than they would have under a different federal environment.
Thank you for that comment. I think that's obviously, we're in a different landscape, but we're also in a moving target. So I think that, we're talking about what is a feasible timeline to integrate these standards, and obviously looking for feedback on that. I see a question in the chat here that maybe we can get to as well.
Yeah, I was also just going to remind folks that are attending via Zoom, if you do have comments that you would like to make, please use the raise hand functionality of Zoom, and we will be able to unmute you and call on you.
So I'll take the second part of this question and then maybe hand it to another person for the other part. So there's a question here about revenue thresholds. But I just want to say, with respect to, we did mention that statute does authorize CARB to collect an administrative fee to cover the costs of the reporting system, the administration of the reporting system. We are developing a proposal, some proposals and concepts for what it would cost to administer a reporting system, and we look forward to sharing that publicly. So we've mentioned, I think, in prior workshops about the statutory language related to administrative fees. We haven't put forward any specific proposals yet for administrative fees, but as we mentioned, we're looking to develop a pretty streamlined reporting system that would obviously look to assess a minimum amount of fees on any reporting industry or reporting entity, and those fees would only be focused on administering a reporting system. So maintaining the infrastructure needed to and staff required to implement the data collection system. So those fees would not be related to any type of the data that's reported with respect to goals or targets that we might adopt later.
Yeah, and I see there was another part of that question relating to, again, questions on revenue thresholds and who is actually included under those. And so the revenue would be at the company level, not the facility level. And so that would be company-wide revenue, would basically give you that if statement. And then if you are producing building products that are sent into California and doing business in California, then you potentially have a reporting obligation for those covered materials under the current staff concept and framework.
We have a raised hand online. So Michal Haramati, you should be able to unmute and give your comment.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thanks for this very thoughtful approach that you presented in this meeting and the others. So with regards to the 2 years of eligible data for the EPDs versus the 5 years, it's sort of part of the standard approach. We would love to see the CARB EPD standards be consistent with what's required in other regions within North America. And I think the reality of this is really that the CARB standards are, CARB in general and California is kind of the most advanced of the states who are working on embodied carbon reductions. And so California is the best resourced and the most has made the most progress on this to date. So I think the reality is that, especially in absence of federal leadership, what California does is likely to be followed or even adopted by other states. So I just kind of want to communicate the leadership role that CARB is playing here, whether it sort of realizes it or not, but I think especially in light of all of the federal cuts. And I know that's sort of beyond the scope of what you're tasked with looking at within the authorizing legislation, but we would really love to see an approach that could be adopted and contributed to by other states.
Thank you for that comment, and I apologize, I forgot to mention, if you could give your name and affiliation for the Zoom, that would be appreciated.
Yes, thank you for that comment.
Still hear me? Michal Haramati with the Natural Resources Defense Council.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we are definitely interested in how we, any concepts we propose can support and strengthen existing programs. I think obviously there's a number of programs that are looking at EPDs, either regulatory programs or voluntary programs, both within the United States and internationally. And I think that there's obviously there's been a lot of discussion around the limitations of currently available EPDs and focus on facility-specific, product facility-specific EPDs. Buy Clean California obviously focuses on a facility-specific EPD. Other jurisdictions have discussed the challenges as well of the temporal accuracy of EPDs with respect to periods of justification. Buy Clean is another one where, they create a benchmark based on what's available, on what's reported. And then there's a question of, is that benchmark then representative of everything up until the next benchmark is set? And other, in other jurisdictions we've spoken to, as I said, both within the United States and internationally, we've been interested in connecting with those programs to learn more about their perspectives. And I just say statute also identifies the need to collaborate and coordinate with some partner agencies, namely the Department of General Services, the Building Standards Commission, the Housing Community Development, as well as the California Energy Council or Commission, pardon me. And we've been meeting consistently and continue to meet with those partner agencies. I thank folks online who've tuned in from those groups. And we'll continue to coordinate on potential measures that they might update. Obviously, there's been some measures in the legislature this year which have impacted updates on the building code cycle, as many folks are probably aware. And so we were participating in the carbon reduction collaborative workshop series that was around the potential intervening code cycle. It seems that the Building Standards Commission, Division of State Architect will not be adopting any intervening code cycle updates at this point. And we'll talk more about this in the afternoon session. We've made a lot of efforts to ensure that the requirements that we've proposed align well with the existing programmatic requirements, particularly those that are in Section 5409 of mandatory measures for non-residential buildings in the existing CalGreen, and as well, as I mentioned, the prioritization of materials which are already the focus of existing green procurement programs. So those materials which are already subject to Buy Clean California.
Great. And I'm seeing a question that we got relating to HVAC equipment and related facility reporting for that. And so I think the answer is it probably depends on what type of HVAC equipment you're talking about and whether or not it would be covered in this regulation. It's very clear from statute that appliances are exempt, and we've referenced CEC language around what appliances are exempt, and then other potential HVAC equipment may be covered under one of the NAICS or product category codes. If there are other inclusions in our phase 1 or phase 2 lists that we have provided, we encourage you to submit a public comment or reach out to us to discuss gaps that we might have in the staff concepts that we've put forward. I'm seeing no other. Oh, Jordan.
Hi, Jordan Palmieri with CLF. The question is about the phase 3 reporting, changes accepted reporting to 2030. So as manufacturers phase out facility reporting and phase in EPD reporting, is that intended to be included in the 2026 regulations, or will there be sort of a right sizing of that regulation prior to that phase in of 2030?
Yeah, great question. We have not released the staff report or draft regulatory text, which we are hoping to release at the start of next year, because we are presenting that as a concept now. It's not finalized. It's not baked. It's not necessarily in the concept that we will end up with in terms of draft reporting text. But I think right now there is desire to probably put in that clear sunset date for the method 2 reporting. And so I think that creates a lot of transparency and expectation for manufacturers and others. And we have heard for previous programs that manufacturers and other regulated entities appreciate that level of certainty to make long-term investment decisions and strategies and planning around defined dates. So while it is not baked, it has typically been good practice to include clear timelines and time horizons for when we anticipate things to go into effect. I also see a question online related to the facilities already reporting to MRR. And there's a request for more detail on how these requirements relate to MRR, if we report under MRR, and what we are required to do under this program. And so I think it will make a lot more sense for those facilities already reporting under MRR to take a look at our draft reporting templates that we've put out as a staff concept, which would basically have MRR reporting facilities. You provide basic identifying detail so we know what the facility is and who you are and who the reporting entity is. So that's very basic information just to kind of actually run any kind of reporting framework. And then scope 2 and upstream scope 3 emission totals is what would be provided in that template. And so how do you calculate the scope 2 and upstream scope 3 emissions for the facility? The staff concept is that that would be aligned with the calculation methods for method 2 reporting that non-MRR facilities would use, which is basically you would do input quantities by the emissions factors that staff have provided in the method 2 tool. And rather than reporting that input information to us, those underlying calculations would basically be a record keeping requirement. And you could use the method 2 full reporting tool filled out to help meet those record keeping requirements. I hope that made sense to relevant folks that are online or in the room.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Real quick, if I may, I want to do a last call for raised hands in the Zoom. If you have any public comment, please raise your hand now.
Yeah, Joseph Shackett with ERG. This is related to the method 2 reporting. For the EEIO emission factors, do you anticipate updating those annually? And I ask that because the latest update, which was not published by EPA, just comment on that, had a pretty significant changes in the emission factors based on inflationary forces and other factors. There's a pretty big variation from year to year. So I'm just suggesting that might be something to look at.
Yeah, great comment. Definitely, if you have suggestions for frequency of updates and what would be good, that would be good to know. We know that there could be challenges with federal reported data. So we do have approaches, if you take a look at the tool, that does account for inflationary considerations around some of that. And I know that various partners working on EEIO-based accounting methodologies may also have information and thoughts on best practices to move forward in updating some of those CARB default emission values that we're using. But please submit formal comments on what you think an appropriate period or frequency and how best to update the CARB defaults that we have posted. Seeing no other comments, I think we'll move to close this part of the presentation, and I'll pass it over to Alex, and then we'll break for lunch after that and resume at 1 p.m.
I just want to say thank you too for everybody who shared their thoughts and comments today. It's a really fruitful discussion, I think, for us. I heard other people recognize that as well. We obviously are taking a lot of notes and look forward to integrating feedback that we're going to receive into the concepts that we've presented today. Obviously, we really do rely very strongly on written comments because they're so useful with respect to our rulemaking process. So we hope folks will take the time to submit some written comments. We are going to close the written comment period on December 8th. So hopefully plenty of time for folks, given the holiday break, to go home and do some reading, make some chamomile tea, perhaps write some long comment letter. And like I said, we really appreciate the robust discussion today. I've been finding it very, very useful, so I really appreciate it. Oh yeah, and absolutely. Please reach out directly. I think I'm going to be at a couple conferences over the next 2 weeks presenting. I look forward to anybody who's going to be at Greenbuild or at the CalSIMA conference. I'd be happy to meet with them, and please reach out to the Embodied Carbon group. We'd be very interested in having individual stakeholder meetings with any industry groups, particularly if there's other folks that weren't here today. So if you have other groups that you want that would want to weigh in. Reach out to us. We'd be happy to have individual meetings with you and just discuss in more detail. We're very excited. We have some actual concepts out there in more detail now. And we've been sort of waiting for this moment to have really substantive conversations about those concepts. And so, like I said, if you have time, you have other stakeholders who'd like to meet, we'd be happy to meet outside of this forum today.
Just on those stakeholder meetings, could they occur after the public comment deadline?
Yes.
Yeah, we're always happy to meet with stakeholders. Timeframes are tricky sometimes, but please send us emails.
Well, as Hanjiro said, thank you so much for being here and for providing us feedback on these topics. Again, we also encourage you to submit written comments for anybody in the Zoom. That link is in the Zoom chat, and I can send it again before we break for lunch. And again, you can review all of the content from all of our workshops and technical meetings, including today's meeting, at the first link in this slide, and that is also in the Zoom chat. And you can submit the written comments via the docket. That is the second link in this slide. Before we conclude this section of today's workshop, we would just like to review one more time where we are in the process and look at the next steps. In September, we held a technical meeting on baseline development, which can be reviewed in the past meeting materials using the link in the previous slide. This morning's workshop focused on reporting requirements for material manufacturers and importers. This afternoon's workshop will focus on project reporting requirements and the staff concepts around that. Staff plans to review all feedback on the materials presented today, and we will use this feedback to update the reporting templates and other associated staff concepts, as well as to inform the rest of the regulatory process. A draft staff report will be released prior to a third public workshop, which we hope to hold early next year. And all of this will be announced via our GovDelivery email list. So on the off chance that any of you are not signed up for that, please do. For the Zoom folks, I will drop a link in the chat here shortly. And finally, the release of draft regulatory text is going to come along with that third public workshop. And we target a board hearing date of May 2026, so May of next year. And then we would hope that the reporting regulation would be slated to come into effect at the beginning of 2027. This concludes the morning session of the technical meeting. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and we will return at 1 p.m. after lunch for the afternoon session, in which, again, we're going to go over staff concepts on project reporting.